I'm Timothy. Join me as I uncover the stories of when Karen entitlement turns fatal. From a Karen who kicked a dog in its own enclosure to another who climbed over a pool fence to confront a group of teenagers, which, believe me, didn't end well.
It was March 14th, 2016, in Youngstown, Ohio. The fabrication plant was running at full capacity, hydraulic presses cycling in sequence across the production floor, the sound of metal on metal carrying through the building. Yellow safety barriers marked the boundary between the walkway and the active production area. Brenda Cole, 49, was a procurement supervisor for a manufacturing firm that sourced parts from the plant, known for pushing suppliers to meet tight timelines and for insisting issues be handled on her terms. 6 weeks after placing an order for pressed metal brackets, her team flagged 2 pieces as slightly out of tolerance, a minor issue that could have gone through standard quality review. Brenda disagreed. She decided it needed to be handled immediately, bypassed the usual process, put the parts in a bag, and drove to the plant herself. And I get it. After waiting that long for an other, no one wants to receive anything defective, but well, she decided to take action right away. When she arrived at the factory, the plant supervisor met her at the front desk and explained the process. Any quality dispute needed to go through the quality control team. A formal inspection would be scheduled and a report would be issued within 2 business days. Brenda told him 2 days was not acceptable. She said she needed the issue verified immediately and in person because her production line was depending on the parts. The supervisor said he understood, but that the process existed for safety and accuracy reasons, and that he could not take her onto the active floor during a running shift. He offered her a seat in the waiting area and said he would contact the QC team directly to expedite the review. She remained seated for approximately 4 minutes before bypassing the access control point without authorization. And this is the moment I keep coming back to. 4 minutes. She lasted 4 minutes before she decided the process was taking too long. When she bypassed the access control point without authorization, a floor worker near the entrance saw her immediately and moved toward her, telling her she needed to go back to the waiting area. Brenda told him she just needed a minute and kept walking. She had spotted the press line where the components in question were being produced and she was heading toward it. The hydraulic press she approached was configured for automatic operation with the feed area marked by physical guards and a painted boundary, but no active safeguard covering the area she had stepped into. The worker assigned to the machine was stationed at the control panel, outside the point of operation, monitoring the cycle. He saw Brenda approaching and told her clearly to step back and stay behind the painted floor boundary, indicating the restricted point of operation zone. Brenda told him she just needed to show him something and held up one of the parts she had brought. What gets me is that 3 separate people told her to stop before she reached that machine. 3, and she kept moving. She stepped closer to the machine, leaned forward toward the feed table to point out what she believed was wrong with the component, and placed her hand on the feed table to steady herself, leaning past the marked boundary and extending into the point of operation hazard area directly in front of the die. The press was mid-cycle in automatic operation. No input or obstruction interrupted the cycle. The upper die descended and completed its full rated stroke. Brenda's hand was on the feed table directly in front of the die when it came down. The press completed its stroke with her hand beneath it. The force was sufficient to crush through bone and tissue in a single movement, pulling her forward into the point of operation. She collapsed immediately at the base of the machine. The worker activated the emergency stop as the stroke completed. Other workers responded within seconds and emergency services were called. The plant halted all operations. The machine was taken out of service and isolated under lockout/tagout control pending investigation. Brenda Cole was transported from the scene and later pronounced dead from crush injuries sustained at the point of operation of an industrial hydraulic press. The worker who witnessed the incident at close range was later placed on psychiatric leave for 4 months. The worker going on psychiatric leave is the one detail that reminds me there are always more people affected than just the one we read about. Investigators reconstructed the sequence: unauthorized entry onto an active production floor, disregard of 2 separate instructions to step back from a marked hazard zone. The death was ruled accidental. The part I genuinely find disturbing is that Brenda Cole had walked past every barrier and ignored every instruction to get to that machine, and was identified as initiating unsafe act leading to the fatal incident.
It was March 12th, 2013. The Swiss Alps stretched under deceptively calm skies, hiding dangers that would claim a life before sunset. Greta Zimmermann, a 65-year-old retired schoolteacher from Zurich, was at the base of a restricted avalanche zone with her husband Klaus, drawn by terrain that would test her lifelong habit of bending rules for recognition. Greta had spent 40 years hiking alpine trails, accumulating an impressive catalog of summit photos and trail completions across Switzerland and Austria. She had a reputation among fellow hikers as someone who argued loudly with rangers and staff. She frequently told other hikers that particular signages were ridiculous and that she deserved access because she was experienced and had hiked these mountains for decades. Friends described her as fearless but dismissive of authority, and she often escalated minor disputes into verbal confrontations over perceived restrictions. Alpine hiking demands respect for rapidly changing conditions, where avalanche-prone slopes can release without warning when snowpack stability deteriorates, requiring constant assessment of terrain features and weather patterns that determine whether a trail remains passable or becomes a deadly trap. Although experienced, she had left her avalanche transceiver and airbag behind that morning, saying she only planned a quick shot. That morning, regional avalanche services had issued critical warnings across the Alps. Fresh snowfall throughout the previous week had created unstable layers, and rising temperatures were destabilizing snowpack on south-facing slopes. Multiple trails near the popular resort area where Greta and Klaus were staying had been closed with barriers and prominent warning signs detailing extreme avalanche danger. Weather bulletins explicitly warned against any off-piste activity or venturing near closed trails. Klaus urged Greta to stay within the resort boundaries, pointing to the warning signs and recent avalanche bulletins posted at the base lodge. She dismissed his concerns, saying the closed trail offered perfect photo opportunities and that authorities were overly cautious. Other hikers at the lodge noticed the couple's discussion and watched as Greta approached the barrier marking the restricted zone. Greta had ducked under the barrier and walked approximately 300 feet up the closed trail. Klaus remained at the barrier, visibly distressed. Several guests at the base lodge watched through the large windows as Greta positioned herself for a selfie against the mountain backdrop. A guest raised binoculars. Above her, the massive snowfield showed subtle signs of instability that she either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The slope angle exceeded 35 degrees, well within the critical range for slab avalanche formation. The vibrations from her movement triggered the release. The snowfield fractured with a deep crack that propagated rapidly across the slope. Witnesses at the lodge saw the entire mountainside begin moving, a massive wall of snow cascading downward with terrifying speed. Trees snapped like twigs as the avalanche gained momentum, consuming everything in its path. Greta disappeared instantly into the churning white mass. Klaus screamed for help as the avalanche thundered past, stopping roughly 150 feet from where he stood. Lodge staff immediately contacted mountain rescue services. The avalanche had deposited debris across a wide area, burying the trail under tons of compacted snow. Rescue teams arrived within 30 to 40 minutes with probes and avalanche search dogs. The dogs helped narrow search areas, but careful probing and shovel lines were still required. Rescuers located Greta's body 4 hours later, after a prolonged search by which point survival was, tragically, no longer realistic. She had died from asphyxiation, her airways completely blocked by snow she'd inhaled during the tumbling descent. The medical examiner noted multiple traumatic injuries from colliding with trees and debris during the avalanche's violent descent, along with evidence of hypothermia that contributed to her death. Klaus returned to Zurich with Greta's remains. A small funeral was held at the local cemetery, attended by close family and a few hiking friends.
It was November 14th, 2018, inside a suburban supermarket in Surrey, England. In the meat department near the back of the store, the tile floor was still slightly damp from routine cleaning earlier that afternoon. Nadine Killer, 61, worked as a receptionist and administrative assistant at a small accounting office nearby. She had held the position for nearly 2 decades, answering phones, organizing files, and scheduling client meetings with careful attention to detail. That same meticulous mindset followed her everywhere, including the supermarket she visited several times each week after work. Co-workers described her as efficient but outspoken, someone who believed strongly in pointing out mistakes when she saw them. Store employees recognized her as a frequent shopper who paid close attention to prices and product labels. She was known to stop staff members to question promotions or challenge shelf tags she believed were inaccurate. Most interactions were brief, but they often involved raised voices and long explanations about fairness or customer rights. That afternoon, Nadine entered the store shortly before 4:30. By the time she reached the meat department, her cart already carried several items from earlier aisles, and she had opened a bag of chips from the cart, eating them as she slowly compared prices along the refrigerated displays. When she stopped in front of a row of packaged chicken breasts and leaned closer to read the label, the price immediately irritated her. A store stock clerk working nearby noticed her studying the shelf tag and approached to continue restocking trays behind the counter. Nadine turned toward him and began complaining loudly about the price difference between two brands displayed side by side. She pointed sharply at the labels while holding the half-opened bag of chips in her other hand. The clerk tried explaining that one package was part of a temporary promotion, but Nadine continued speaking over him, raising her voice as nearby shoppers slowed their carts to watch the exchange. As she continued arguing, Nadine stepped sideways and slightly backward to make room for another customer pushing a cart down the aisle, her attention still fixed on the shelf display and the employee standing across from her rather than the floor beneath her feet. Her shoe suddenly slid across the damp tile, and in an instant her balance gave way as the movement sent her body pitching forward toward the stainless steel edge of the meat counter. The front of her jaw slammed into the sharp steel edge of the meat counter with a crack, before the rest of her body collapsed onto the floor, the sound drawing startled looks from nearby customers. The bag of chips slipped from her hand and skidded across the tile beside her. For a moment, Nadine lay on her side without moving. Then her arms jerked once before going still. Blood began spreading across the floor beneath her head as startled shoppers rushed toward her. One customer knelt beside her and checked for breathing, while another pulled out a phone and called emergency services. Store staff quickly cleared the area as paramedics arrived several minutes later. Nadine was unconscious and breathing irregularly when they placed her onto a stretcher and transported her to a nearby hospital. Doctors later determined she had suffered severe traumatic brain injury from the impact. She never regained consciousness and died 2 days later after the swelling inside her skull proved irreversible. Security footage from an overhead camera later confirmed the sequence of events. Store management reviewed cleaning procedures and signage placement following the incident. It was May 3, 2016 in Austin, Texas, northbound on Interstate 35 near the Palmer Lane construction corridor. Afternoon heat hung over narrowed lanes where concrete barriers pressed tight to the stripe. A loaded cement mixer moved within the speed limit ahead. The unfinished shoulder was loose gravel, leaving little room to correct if a vehicle left the lane. Angela Rudd, 51, worked as a regional retail supervisor who spent most weeks driving between stores from Round Rock to South Austin. Her days ran on mileage, inspections, and quick stops between locations. Friends said she often complained about delays on the road. Co-workers noticed she followed cars closely, tapped the horn quickly, and showed little patience for slow merges. Her messages at work were short and focused on cutting time from store visits. She drove a 2014 Ford Explorer used for store inspections, usually carrying paperwork and display materials in the back. That afternoon, she headed north toward inspections near the Palmer Lane work zone, where construction narrowed 3 lanes to 2. Concrete barriers tightened the roadway, and the shoulder beside them was unfinished gravel marked off by cones and warning signs. Traffic slowed as vehicles approached the lane shift. The cement mixer ahead maintained a steady pace between 30 and 35 miles per hour, consistent with the posted limit through the construction area. Angela's SUV closed tightly behind the truck. Witnesses later said she leaned forward toward the windshield and sounded the horn repeatedly as the line of vehicles continued at the reduced speed. As traffic slowed further at the lane transition, drivers remained in line behind the cement mixer moving through the work zone. Several witnesses later reported that Angela's SUV suddenly moved right, crossing past the temporary cones that marked the shoulder as closed. The Explorer accelerated onto the gravel shoulder, attempting to pass the cement mixer along the construction edge of the roadway. The shoulder surface was uneven and loose. As the SUV accelerated along the gravel shoulder, dust rose behind the vehicle while the tires bounced across deep ruts left by construction equipment. Witnesses saw the Explorer drifting closer to the concrete barrier segments that lined the edge of the narrowed roadway. The right front tire struck the angled base of one of the temporary barrier sections, forcing the steering sharply left. The SUV rotated sideways and tipped onto the driver's side, sliding across the pavement toward the lane where the cement mixer was traveling. The truck driver applied the brakes immediately, but the heavy vehicle had only a short distance to react in the narrowed lane. The front of the mixer struck the overturned SUV and pushed it several feet before both vehicles came to a stop in the narrowed lane. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic halted while responders secured both vehicles. Angela was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported fatal crushing injuries after the truck pressed into the driver's side of the overturned SUV, collapsing the cabin. Investigators documented tire tracks along the gravel shoulder and barrier impacts. Witnesses said the SUV left the lane to pass on the construction shoulder. The reconstruction concluded the crash resulted from an illegal pass in an active work zone. Lanes stayed closed for hours before reopening. It was July 4th, 2018 in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the kind of evening where the whole block smells like charcoal and bug spray and every other house has a flag hanging off the porch. Temperatures had been sitting in the low 90s all day, and by the time the sun started dipping, the air was still warm enough that nobody had gone inside yet. On a quiet residential street, a handful of families had gathered the way they did every year. Lawn chairs dragged to the curb, coolers between driveways, kids running through sprinklers 2 houses down. It was one of those neighborhood setups where nobody really planned it, it just kind of happened because everyone was already outside. Cheryl Goad was 44. She worked at a small billing office, the kind of job where you spend most of your day on the phone sorting out other people's paperwork. Her husband, 46, was a mechanic. They lived nearby and had walked over to join the group once the grilling started winding down. One of the neighbors, a 49-year-old guy who worked in maintenance, had put together a small firework display. Not store-bought fountains or sparklers, he had assembled his own mortar tubes using cardboard, black powder lift charges, and aerial shells pulled from retail firework kits. The tubes were set into a wooden rack on his driveway, angled upright the way they needed to be to launch properly. He had even marked a line on the pavement, roughly 15 feet back, and told everyone to stay behind it. He explained that the tubes had to stay locked in the rack because without that support, the pressure from the lift charge could split the cardboard on ignition. A few people nodded. Most were just waiting for the show. The first few shots went off fine. Shells popped up, burst in the air, and the kids screamed the way kids do. But between rounds, there were gaps. Loading each tube took time, and the pacing started to drag. Cheryl got impatient. She stepped past the marked line and walked toward the rack. The neighbor told her to stop, that one of the tubes was already loaded and ready to fire. She picked it up anyway, just grabbed it out of the rack and held it upright in front of her body. She told someone nearby to go ahead and light it so they could keep things moving. Now, here is where everything falls apart. That tube was about 12 inches long. Inside it sat a 2-inch aerial shell on top of a black powder lift charge. The fuse had been cut shorter earlier in the night to reduce the delay between shots. Without the rack, the tube had no support. It was tilted slightly in her hands, and the structural integrity of the cardboard was now entirely dependent on her grip. The neighbor told her more than once to put it back. She didn't. The fuse was lit while she was still holding the tube. It burned fast, faster than anyone expected. The shortened length meant the flame reached the lift charge almost immediately. The charge ignited, but the shell didn't clear the tube. Instead, the pressure split the cardboard along the side, and the shell burst right there at the top of the tube, inches from her upper body and head. And honestly, it's unsettling to know how close she was to the danger without even realizing it. Witnesses described a loud pop, a flash of smoke, and pieces of the tube scattering across the driveway. Cheryl dropped to the ground instantly and did not move. She never responded. By the time county responders arrived, there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Fire officials examined what was left of the device and confirmed the tube had been removed from the launch rack before ignition. Multiple witnesses gave consistent statements. She had crossed the safety line on her own, picked up the loaded tube despite being warned, and refused to put it back. Investigators also noted the shortened fuse and the lack of support at the time of firing. The components were consistent with consumer-grade fireworks, but the way the device was handled at the moment of ignition created the failure. No charges were filed. The death was ruled accidental firework misuse. What stays with me is how small the window was. She was warned not to cross the line, told the tube was loaded, and told more than once to put it back. Each one a chance to walk away. But impatience doesn't feel dangerous. It just feels like moving things along. And sometimes that's all it takes. And if Cheryl's story taught me anything, it's that impatience doesn't announce itself as danger. It just feels like efficiency.
It was July 20th, 2017, and Phoenix was in the middle of one of its most punishing summers. Temperatures at the city's main airport were hovering above 105 degrees that afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the tarmac shimmer. It was a busy travel day. Gates were full, ground crews were moving efficiently, and flights were running on schedule. Carolyn Floss was 45 years old. She worked in retail management, the kind of role where authority was the default, and being overruled didn't sit well with her. By multiple accounts, she was someone who pushed hard against rules she found inconvenient and expected exceptions to be made. On that afternoon, she was traveling with her 14-year-old nephew, and the two of them arrived at their gate late. Not marginally late, but late enough that boarding calls had already gone out multiple times. By the time they got there, the jet bridge door was sealed. The aircraft, a smaller regional jet, had finished boarding, and the crew was already in pre-departure procedures. A gate worker explained the door was closed and the flight was not returning to the gate. That did not go over well. Carolyn began arguing with the staff, raising her voice, filming the encounter on her phone, and accusing the workers of abusing their authority. Other travelers watched. Multiple staff members tried to de-escalate. None of it landed. I want to be fair. Missing a flight with a teenager in tow is genuinely stressful. I get that. What I don't understand is what she did next. While attention near the gate briefly shifted, she moved toward a service access point along the side of the terminal, a door used intermittently by ground crew for ramp access. In that narrow window, she made it through into the secured ramp area. An alarm activated the moment she crossed that threshold. Ground personnel on the ramp spotted her and moved to intercept, shouting for her to stop. She did not. She continued moving across the active tarmac toward the aircraft, which had just begun taxiing away from the gate with its engines running at low to moderate power. The fact that it was a smaller regional jet matters here. That type has engines mounted lower on the fuselage, which puts the intake hazard zone much closer to ground level. Most people never think about what that kind of engine does to the air around it. By the time you feel the pull, you're already past a point of no return. As she moved into the marked hazard perimeter, the airflow became strong enough to disrupt her footing. Witnesses on the ramp later reported seeing loose debris near her shifting toward the engine. Her clothing pulled forward. She lost her balance and went down on the pavement. The intake forces at that range pulled her further forward after she lost her footing, drawing her deeper into the immediate hazard zone, where she sustained severe blunt force trauma. The flight crew initiated an emergency engine shutdown within seconds of visual confirmation. But that call, fast as it was, came too late. This is the story I just couldn't stop thinking about, not because it was so shocking, but because she had so many chances to turn around and just kept going. Emergency responders secured the ramp area within minutes. Carolyn Floss was pronounced deceased at the scene. Her nephew, who stayed in the gate area, was taken into the care of relatives. He was not physically harmed. Investigators reviewed alarm logs, ramp footage, and statements from gate staff and ground crew. Findings were consistent. Safety systems were active and functioning throughout. Warnings had been issued at every stage. She continued past all of them. The incident was classified as a fatality resulting from unauthorized entry into an active aircraft movement area and contact with engine hazard forces. No equipment failure was identified. No airport procedural failures were found. Everything worked. The alarm triggered. The crew responded. The systems did exactly what they were built to do. The only thing that failed was the one decision that started all of it.
It was May 19th, 2018. The Overtoom bike lane in Amsterdam stretched wide and busy under overcast skies, a main artery where thousands of cyclists commuted daily through one of Europe's most bike-dependent cities. Brigitte van der Berg, a 52-year-old administrative assistant at a local municipal office, walked in the center of the lane with her terrier on a long, retractable leash, trailing across the pavement, blocking traffic during the evening rush. Brigitte had worked in Amsterdam for 3 decades, but had never adapted to the city's cycling culture. Colleagues described her as stubborn and confrontational, someone who took minor inconveniences personally. She owned no bicycle herself, preferring to walk her dog Max through whatever route seemed convenient, regardless of designated bike infrastructure. Friends had warned her repeatedly about wandering into bike lanes, but she always disregarded their concerns. Amsterdam's bike lanes operate like highways, with cyclists traveling at speeds between 15 and 25 miles per hour in dedicated infrastructure, separated from pedestrian walkways by clear markings and physical barriers. The Overtoom lane was particularly fast-moving, serving as a commuter route where cargo bikes hauling children and goods mixed with racing cyclists and electric bikes. Pedestrians entering these lanes face serious injury risk, a fact reinforced by city safety campaigns Brigitte had seen but ignored. That evening, Brigitte walked Max directly into the bike lane despite pedestrian crossings located every 50 yards. Multiple cyclists rang their bells frantically as she meandered along, looking at her phone while her dog sniffed the pavement. Traffic backed up behind her, a dozen riders forced to slow from 20 miles per hour to a crawl. A delivery cyclist shouted at her to move. Brigitte stopped completely, turning to yell back that she had every right to be there. The delivery rider swerved around her, clipping another cyclist and crashing onto the pavement. His groceries scattered across the lane. Instead of stepping aside, Brigitte began shouting louder about reckless cyclists, completely oblivious to the cargo bike approaching from behind at a distance too short for the rider to safely stop, approximately 25 feet away. The cargo bike's operator, transporting two children in the front box, rang his bell repeatedly while braking hard. Brigitte remained planted in place, gesturing angrily at the crashed delivery cyclist. The cargo bike, weighing approximately 200 pounds loaded with its riders and cargo, struck Brigitte from behind at approximately 20 miles per hour, the impact lifting her off her feet. Her body flew forward feet before her head struck the top of a waist-high Amsterdammertje, a narrow, unpadded steel bollard lining the lane's edge. The hollow metallic clang echoed through the street as Brigitte crumpled to the ground. The leash released from her hand as it slipped free under tension while bystanders screamed. The cargo bike operator fell sideways, protecting his children, who were shaken but uninjured. A pedestrian called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, finding Brigitte unconscious with visible head trauma and labored breathing. She died en route to the hospital, despite resuscitation attempts. The autopsy revealed massive cranial fractures, thoracic trauma, 6 broken ribs, and severe internal hemorrhaging. The medical examiner confirmed the steel bollard impact as the primary cause of death, with blunt force trauma from the initial bike collision contributing. Amsterdam authorities used the incident to reinforce pedestrian safety regulations in bike lanes, installing additional warning signs along the Overtoom route. Investigators noted that nearby municipal CCTV and a cyclist helmet camera had captured the sequence of events, helping reconstruct the collision. Brigitte's terrier Max was rescued at the scene after being quickly retrieved by a bystander during the chaos, and later adopted by her neighbor, who had repeatedly warned her about the bike lanes she refused to respect.
It was October 18, 2016. The humid evening air along Chang Klan Road carried the smell of grilled meat and exhaust fumes as crowds moved through the night bazaar, Chang Klan Road. Between the vendor stalls and the slow-moving traffic lane, tourists and locals navigated a space where pedestrians and vehicles shared an uncomfortable proximity. Roxanne Pfeiffer, a 56-year-old bookkeeping assistant from Munich, Germany, had built her travel routine around maximizing value. Working for a mid-sized logistics firm, she took 2 Southeast Asian trips annually, planning each meticulously to stretch her modest salary. Friends who had accompanied her on previous journeys described her aggressive approach to bargaining, often turning minor purchases into lengthy negotiations over amounts equivalent to a few dollars. During her 3-week Thailand vacation, Roxanne had spent multiple evenings walking the night bazaar stalls. While vendors expected haggling, regular merchants recognized the difference between normal negotiation and confrontation. Roxanne frequently crossed that line, lingering at stalls long after prices had been refused refused, challenging vendors loudly enough to draw attention from nearby shoppers. That evening at 8:35, Roxanne stopped at a narrow cart operated by a man who sold grilled skewers and fried snacks. A Norwegian backpacker sat eating noodles at a plastic table 15 feet away when Roxanne began loudly accusing the vendor of charging tourists inflated prices. When the vendor continued serving other customers, Roxanne reached over the counter and picked up a metal tray of fried items, inspecting them while repeating that the pricing was ridiculous. The vendor's adult son stepped forward from behind the cart, demanding she return the tray. The argument escalated as passers-by slowed to watch. The night bazaar stretched along Chang Klan Road, where food vendors positioned carts at the boundary between pedestrian walkways and the traffic lane that remained open to small three-wheeled taxi vehicles, known locally as tuk-tuks, along with motorcycles. Drivers navigated through crowds that often spilled into the roadway without warning. Still gripping the tray, Roxanne stepped backward while gesturing at the son. Witnesses stated she never glanced behind her. The traffic lane lay directly at her back, less than 3 feet from where she stood arguing. A tuk-tuk approached the stall at approximately 10 miles per hour. Roxanne stepped directly into his path. The driver hit the brake and horn simultaneously, but the vehicle was only about 12 feet away. The front bumper struck the back of Roxanne's knees with enough force to hyperextend both legs, pivoting her hips forward before her upper body snapped backward. She fell hard onto the asphalt roadway, the back of her skull striking the pavement with what Anders later described to police as a sharp cracking sound that cut through the surrounding market noise. The metal tray clattered across the road, scattering fried food across the asphalt. Roxanne lay motionless in the traffic lane. An obvious scalp laceration bled heavily, and blood began pooling beneath her head within seconds. The tuk-tuk rolled to a complete stop several feet past her body. The vendor's son called Thailand's emergency number after vendors first attempted rudimentary first aid and waved oncoming traffic away, while others signaled approaching vehicles to slow. Local police later photographed the scene, took witness statements. A municipal rescue ambulance reached the scene at 8:51, where paramedics found Roxanne unresponsive, with no detectable pulse or breathing. The initial assessment noted massive trauma to the occipital region of the skull, consistent with high-impact contact against pavement, resulting in catastrophic brain injury. She was transported to a nearby hospital, where doctors later confirmed her death. The driver was briefly detained for questioning and a vehicle inspection before being released pending further investigation. Roxanne's body was repatriated to Munich 2 weeks later. It was October 22, 2014, in Phoenix, Arizona, at Bell Road and 7th Avenue. Evening rush stacked cars across wide lanes. West sun leveled through windshields. Lights cycled long. An air horn sounded from somewhere back. A hatch clicked open as a driver stepped into the intersection where cross traffic would soon begin moving. Tracy Nolan, 49, worked as a warehouse inventory clerk in Phoenix. Co-workers described her as organized but impatient, especially during her daily commute through the city's busy roads. After a vehicle break-in the previous year, she began keeping an aluminum baseball bat in the cargo area of her SUV for protection when parking at shopping centers at night. That evening, she was driving north along Bell Road toward the intersection at 7th Avenue on her way home from work. Traffic slowed as cars queued at the red light. A silver sedan merged into the lane beside her, and witnesses later said Tracy immediately began gesturing through her window and pointing toward the other driver as the vehicles rolled to a stop. Both vehicles stopped near the front of the intersection. Drivers behind them began honking as the exchange continued while the signal held. Witnesses said Tracy leaned out of her window, continuing to gesture toward the sedan while traffic stacked up behind the light. Tracy then stepped out of her SUV, walked to the rear, and opened the hatch. She reached inside and pulled out the bat. Holding it at her side, she walked into the center of the intersection while continuing to confront the driver of the silver sedan, even as the signal phases were about to change and cross traffic prepared to move. As the signal phase changed, the cross street received a green light and traffic began moving through the intersection. Vehicles traveling southbound entered the intersection with the right-of-way. Witnesses said Tracy continued walking diagonally through the intersection toward the sedan while holding the bat at her side. Her attention remained fixed on the other driver. A pickup truck entered the intersection from the cross street as traffic began moving. The driver braked when he saw Tracy step into the lane, but the distance was short and the truck had already begun accelerating from the stop line. The front of the truck struck Tracy on the left side of her body. The impact carried her onto the hood, where her upper body hit near the base of the windshield. The bat slipped from her hand and slid across the pavement. The truck stopped a short distance later. Tracy fell from the hood onto the roadway in front of the vehicle and did not move. Witnesses stepped back from the lane while emergency services were called immediately. Traffic slowed around the intersection as drivers waited for responders to arrive. Fire and medical crews reached the scene within minutes and began emergency care. Despite resuscitation efforts, Tracy was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported the cause of death as blunt force trauma from the collision with the vehicle. Injuries included severe head trauma and multiple fractures consistent with a pedestrian impact. Investigators measured vehicle positions, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed the timing of the traffic signals. The findings determined the pickup truck entered the intersection during its green phase and that Tracy had stepped into active traffic while confronting the other driver. After the investigation concluded and debris was cleared, the intersection reopened to traffic later that evening. It was June 12th, 2016, a Sunday afternoon in Arizona, the kind of day where the heat starts early and doesn't let up. By midday, it was well over 100 degrees outside, the kind of dry, pressing heat that pushes everyone indoors or toward the nearest body of water. The hotel was a mid-range place off a state highway, the type families book for a weekend getaway because it has a pool and a continental breakfast. Nothing resort level, just clean rooms, a parking lot, and a fenced-in pool area between the main building and the back lot. Glenda Quell was 40 years old. She worked as a receptionist at a small office in town and was raising 2 kids on her own, ages 6 and 8. By all accounts, she was the kind of mom who stretched every dollar to make sure her kids had a good time. This trip was one of those efforts, a weekend away from routine, a pool, ice from the machine down the hall, simple stuff that means everything when you're 8. They checked in earlier that day. The kids had been talking about the pool since the car ride, so after settling into the room, Glenda grabbed towels and headed down with both of them. Here's where it turns. The pool area was closed. The gate had a sign on it that read clearly, "Do not enter wet surface." Staff had been cleaning the deck, and the tile around the pool was still soaked. Not damp, wet, the kind of wet where you can see the sheen on the surface from 10 feet away. Glenda opened the gate and walked in anyway. She had the towels over her arm and both kids behind her. A staff member saw them enter and told her directly that the deck was still wet and the area wasn't open yet. According to that staff member's account, Glenda acknowledged it but kept walking. Maybe she figured she'd just set up and wait for it to dry. Maybe she thought wet tile wasn't that serious. I don't know what was going through her head, but she made the decision to stay. I understand the instinct, a parent trying to give her kids a pool day. But the warning was clear, and she chose to ignore it. That's what makes it hard to sit with. Now I need you to picture this pool deck. Standard hotel layout, rectangular pool, maybe 30 feet long with a concrete lip around the edge and tile extending out about 6 feet on each side. The tile was a smooth, light-colored material, the kind that's fine when it's dry but turns into something close to ice when there's a film of water on it. And the whole surface was covered. Glenda walked along the side of the pool, heading toward the far corner where the lounge chairs were stacked. She was stepping around the corner of the pool where the deck narrows slightly. One foot came down on the wet tile and slipped. There was no time to catch herself. Her body went backward. The back of her head struck the concrete edge of the pool on the way down. She was unconscious before she hit the ground. The kids were right there. The 8-year-old ran back toward the gate. The lifeguard, who was on duty inside the adjacent building during the closure, heard the commotion and came out within moments. Glenda was on her back on the deck, unresponsive, with visible trauma to the back of her head. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived and transported her to the nearest hospital, but the injury was severe. A direct impact to the back of the skull against a concrete edge doesn't leave a lot of room for recovery. Glenda was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause was listed as a fatal head injury resulting from a fall on a wet surface. The incident report confirmed that the closure sign had been posted on the gate before she entered. The staff member who warned her gave a statement corroborating that she had been told the area was not open. The hotel documented the event internally, but no structural changes were made to the pool area. The sign stayed, the tile stayed, the gate stayed unlocked, and that's the detail that I keep circling back to. Not the sign, not the warning, not even the wet tile. The gate, it was closed, but not locked. And I'm not saying that to shift blame because Glenda made her own choice to walk in. But I do wonder how different things would have been if that gate simply didn't open. Her kids were 6 and 8. They were standing a few feet away when their mom went down and didn't get back up. That's not something a sign on a gate prepares you for, and it's not something I think those kids will ever fully make sense of. A pool deck, a Sunday afternoon, and a shortcut past a warning that existed for exactly this reason. I think what makes Glenda's story stay with me is how small the window was. One step, one patch of wet tile, one angle of impact. Everything before that moment was fixable. Everything after it wasn't.
It was May 15th, 2018, and a quiet residential community built over volcanic terrain was coming apart in a way no one there had ever experienced. Streets had begun to split. Long cracks cut through yards and pavement. In multiple locations, molten rock had already surfaced, slow but unstoppable. The air carried a sharp sulfur sting, the kind that burned the throat and made breathing feel wrong if you stayed in it too long. What started as warnings had escalated into mandatory evacuation orders. Families packed quickly. Cars filled driveways, then disappeared. Within days, the neighborhood emptied out. Zabby Grohl, 61, did not leave. At first, neighbors assumed she just needed more time, but as conditions worsened, her refusal started to stand out. When utility crews came through urging immediate evacuation, she didn't just decline, she pushed back. When officials explained the severity, she reportedly insisted she understood the risks better than they did. She framed it as control, as awareness, as being more capable than the people knocking on her door. She wasn't panicking like everyone else. She wasn't overreacting. This was her property, and she made it clear she wasn't going to be told what to do with it. By the time the last neighbors were leaving, some described a shift, not just attachment, but defiance. She was still outside, moving things around, monitoring the situation herself, acting as if the evacuation was optional guidance meant for other people. The same warnings everyone else heard, she filtered differently. In her mind, this wasn't an emergency she needed to obey. It was an inconvenience she intended to outlast. The ground had been changing for days. Cracks widened across roads and yards. Gas levels fluctuated. The smell in the air wasn't constant. Sometimes it faded just enough to feel manageable, reinforcing the idea that the situation was under control. She continued working outside in that environment, adjusting belongings, staying active, staying present, as if visibility meant safety. Then a new fissure opened nearby. With it came a surge in volcanic gas output, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide pushing up from underground. The terrain wasn't flat or predictable. It dipped, pocketed, and uneven lava formations created natural low points where gases could settle. Carbon dioxide, heavier than air, collected silently in these areas, displacing oxygen without warning. Sulfur dioxide lingered as an irritant, burning, choking, forcing the body into distress. There isn't always smoke. There isn't always a visible cue, and by the time symptoms start, the body is already losing the ability to respond. She was outside when conditions shifted. Exposure at that level doesn't unfold slowly. Carbon dioxide reduces available oxygen, leading to dizziness, confusion, then rapid loss of consciousness. At the same time, sulfur dioxide inflames the lungs, triggering coughing, panic, and impaired breathing. Together, they create a narrowing window, seconds to minutes, where awareness slips before a person fully processes what's happening. There were no witnesses. What investigators later reconstructed came from position, gas measurements, and eruption timelines. She collapsed on her own property. What stays with me isn't just that she stayed, it's how firmly she believed she was the exception. The orders were clear, the risk was visible. People had already proven what the right decision looked like by leaving. But somewhere in that progression, she placed her judgment above all of it. Above officials, above neighbors, above the environment itself. By the time responders could safely return, she was unresponsive. She was found where she had chosen to remain. The cause of death was hazardous gas exposure, oxygen displacement from carbon dioxide accumulating in a low-lying area, compounded by respiratory distress from sulfur dioxide during active fissure emissions. The evacuation order had been documented. The advisories had been repeated. The conditions had been escalating in plain sight, and still, she stayed.
Zabby's case changes the way the pattern reads. Every danger before this feels external, something advancing, something you can step away from. But here, the threat didn't need to chase her. It didn't need speed or force. It only required one decision to stand still and believe the rules didn't apply. That's what makes it different. Because the most dangerous factor in that entire environment wasn't just the gas rising from the ground. It was the certainty that she didn't have to listen.
It was July 22nd, 2016, in Scottsdale, Arizona. The evening heat was still sitting heavy over the hotel pool deck, the kind of dry Arizona warmth that did not ease much after sundown. The pool lights had come on and the deck was busy. Guests spread out on loungers and around the shallow end, drinks on the tables and towels draped over chairs. Carla Jennings, 52, was an insurance agent from Phoenix who had driven up to Scottsdale for a 2-night stay while attending a professional development conference. The conference was one of the most important events on her calendar that year. She had paid nearly $800 for her ticket and had spent the previous week preparing specifically because one of her biggest clients was attending, and she had arranged to meet with him over dinner the following evening. She had checked in that afternoon, changed, and come down to the pool to relax and clear her head before dinner. A group of teenagers was occupying the far end of the pool. They had returned from a nearby outing and were using the pool the way teenagers do, talking loudly, splashing each other, holding phones up to record short videos. They were not fighting. They were not bothering other guests directly. A couple nearby glanced over once and then went back to their drinks. Nobody else on the deck seemed particularly troubled by it. And look, I want to be fair here. Loud teenagers at a hotel pool after a long conference day is genuinely annoying. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Carla was troubled by it. She sat on her lounger and watched the group, her irritation building steadily. After several minutes, she got up and walked to the pool desk. She told the staff member on duty, calmly and clearly, that she understood people were enjoying themselves, but that this was not what a hotel pool was supposed to feel like. She said there were adults trying to relax and that things were getting out of hand. The staff member said the group were hotel guests and had not violated any pool rules. Carla said she would like to speak to the manager. The manager came out and listened. He looked at the group and reached the same conclusion as his staff member. The teenagers were loud but within normal bounds. There was no rule violation and nothing to enforce. He told Carla he was sorry she was uncomfortable, but that he could not ask guests to leave without cause. Carla looked at him for a moment and then asked quietly if there was no standard for noise at this hotel. She asked if anyone could just take over the pool like this, and there was nothing to be done about it. The manager said he understood her frustration and suggested the quieter seating area on the other side of the deck. Carla said she had not come to the pool to sit on the other side of the deck, and this is where it starts to shift, because up to this point she had done everything right. She went through the proper channels. She made her case calmly. The problem is, she could not accept the answer, and I won't support that because this is a public space. She walked away from the desk. A few guests nearby had watched the exchange. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. To Carla, it felt like she was the only person willing to say what everyone was thinking. If the manager was not going to handle it, she would. The main entrance to the pool surround was on the far side of the deck, which would have meant walking past the manager's desk again. She had already been dismissed once and had no intention of doing that. The decorative fence directly in front of her was low. She was already standing next to it. The part that surprised me was what she did next. She reached for the top rail and began climbing over. She was going to walk up to the teenagers herself and tell them directly that they needed to lower the volume because it was not appropriate. She got one leg over the top. As she shifted her weight to bring the second leg across her heel, caught on the upper rung. She had nothing to hold on to. Her weight had already passed the center point of the fence and there was no way to pull back. Her grip slipped slightly as she tried to steady herself, and then she went over forward. She fell forward over the fence and landed head first on the concrete pool deck. The impact was direct and immediate, concentrated on her head with no ability to brace or cushion it. She did not move after she hit the ground. Guests within 10 feet of the fence heard the sound and turned immediately. They moved toward her while others called for staff. The teenagers in the pool went silent. Someone called 911. Hotel staff reached her within seconds. Carla was unresponsive on the deck. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Carla Jennings was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 52 years old. The cause of death was ruled as severe blunt force head trauma sustained in an accidental fall. Hotel management and local authorities reviewed the incident. Security footage confirmed the sequence. Carla had approached staff, made a formal complaint, been given a reasonable response, rejected it, and then attempted to climb a pool barrier to confront the teenagers herself. The fall was determined to be accidental. The teenagers were interviewed by responding officers and released. And the part that stays with me about Carla Jennings is that the manager gave her a perfectly reasonable option. She just refused to take it. The pool was closed for the remainder of the evening.
It was August 3rd, 2017. The afternoon sun beat down on a mid-tier hotel pool in Seminyak, Bali, where families splashed in the shallow end and tourists lounged under rented umbrellas. Diane Mitchell, a 48-year-old administrative manager from Perth, Australia, sat rigid in her deck chair, visibly irritated by the noise around her. Diane had earned a reputation back home for being difficult. Neighbors complained about her filing noise complaints against children playing in their yards. Her homeowners association record showed multiple disputes over minor infractions. Co-workers described her as controlling and quick to escalate disagreements into formal complaints. They said she approached life with a rigid sense of order, believing rules applied absolutely to everyone except herself, when inconvenient. This trip to Bali was supposed to be a reset after being forced into stress leave following workplace conflicts. But Diane's confrontational nature traveled with her. The hotel pool area was designed for family use, with designated quiet zones clearly marked away from the main swimming area. Diane had deliberately chosen a lounger in the active family section, despite staff suggesting the adults-only pool on the property's other side. She refused to move, insisting she had the right to sit where she pleased, and staff did not want to escalate the disagreement. She spent the morning glaring at children and muttering complaints to other guests, most of whom ignored her increasingly hostile demeanor. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, a 14-year-old Indonesian boy named Adi accidentally splashed water near Diane's chair while playing with friends. Diane exploded from her seat, screaming profanities at the teenager. Adi apologized immediately in broken English, but Diane continued her tirade, demanding he be removed from the pool area. Hotel staff began approaching to de-escalate the situation. Before staff could intervene, Diane spotted Adi's tablet device sitting poolside and grabbed it. Multiple witnesses watched in shock as she held it over the water, taunting the boy before hurling it into the deep end. The expensive device sank immediately to the pool's 8-foot-deep bottom. Adi, panicked about losing his family's only tablet, dove after it without hesitation, despite being an inexperienced swimmer. Staff were momentarily distracted by other guests, and initial shouts were mistaken for horseplay, so no one reached the boy immediately. The boy struggled underwater, his movements visible through the clear water, as he grasped the tablet but couldn't push himself back up. His friends screamed for help. Diane stood at the pool, arms crossed. Adi's father, who had been inside the hotel, came running as the on-duty lifeguard and hotel security entered the water. The chaotic rescue attempt took nearly 45 seconds. Adi was pulled out after struggling underwater due to panic and the weight of the tablet, and CPR was initiated immediately while someone called emergency services. During the commotion, Adi's uncle, witnessing the entire incident and overcome with rage, shoved through the crowd and struck Diane once in the face with a closed fist. The punch sent Diane stumbling backward. Her feet slipped on the wet tiles, and she fell hard, the back of her skull impacting the slick concrete pool, coping with a sickening crack. She collapsed onto the deck, blood from a scalp laceration immediately pooling beneath her head. Paramedics arrived following a call from the staff. Adi regained consciousness and survived. Diane did not. She was pronounced dead at a local hospital 90 minutes later. The coroner's report identified severe skull fractures at the base of her head, massive internal bleeding between her brain and skull, and fatal brain swelling. Death resulted from blunt force trauma to the head sustained in the fall. Adi's uncle was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. He received a suspended sentence. Diane's family settled civil claims filed by the hotel and Adi's family for property destruction and endangerment.
It was August 5, 2013. The medieval canals of Bruges, Belgium, wound through centuries-old stone architecture beneath bridges built when clearance measurements were an afterthought. That afternoon, one of those bridges would claim a life in the most preventable way imaginable. Harriet Fleming, a 63-year-old from Gloucester, England, had spent 32 years working administrative shifts at a dental clinic before retiring 6 months earlier. She traveled frequently on packaged European tours, documenting historical sites in spiral notebooks she kept stacked in her study. Her friends described her as opinionated and detail-oriented, someone who frequently corrected tour guides based on articles she'd read online. That August, Harriet had booked a week-long Belgium tour, arriving in Bruges on her 5th day. She signed up for an afternoon canal boat tour through the city center, a popular tourist attraction showcasing Gothic architecture and medieval bridges. The open, low-profile tour boats carried 20 to 30 passengers and navigated narrow waterways originally built for medieval cargo transport. The tour lasted approximately 30 minutes. In Bruges, canal boats pass under low 13th century stone bridges, requiring passengers to duck. Built for smaller vessels, the arches pose a head injury risk on modern boats, so operators routinely warn passengers to stay seated. From the tour's beginning at 1:45 in the afternoon, Harriet repeatedly interrupted the captain's narration, insisting several historical facts were incorrect, according to an online article she'd read. Passengers later reported the interruptions continued for nearly 20 minutes, creating noticeable tension aboard. As the boat approached one of the canal's lowest medieval bridges, the captain announced over the speaker system that everyone must remain seated. He repeated the warning seconds later, while a crew member stepped toward Harriet and gestured firmly for her to sit down. Harriet stood anyway, raising her camera to photograph the bridge from a higher angle. Several passengers told her to sit down. Patrick O'Leary, a retired schoolteacher from Dublin seated at the stern, had a clear view of both Harriet and the approaching stone arch. The clearance between the bridge and the top of the passenger seating area measured approximately 3 feet. Patrick watched Harriet remain upright, still adjusting her camera, as the boat drifted beneath the medieval stonework. The bridge struck the top of her skull as the boat passed beneath the stone arch. The impact produced what witnesses described as a sharp cracking sound before Harriet collapsed backward into the aisle, her camera clattering across the deck. Blood pooled rapidly beneath her head as passengers shouted for the captain to stop. Her body convulsed briefly before going still, eyes fixed and unresponsive. The captain radioed canal authorities at 2:08 in the afternoon and steered toward the nearest dock roughly 200 yards away. Emergency medical responders reached the dock in approximately 8 minutes, finding Harriet with no pulse or respiration. The medical examiner later determined she had suffered catastrophic brain trauma, along with a fatal cervical spine injury, with death likely occurring within seconds of the impact. The Canal Tour Company reviewed its safety briefing procedures following the incident, though no regulatory changes were mandated. Aside from a brief mention in a regional Belgian newspaper, Harriet's death drew minimal attention. The bridge where she died remains a regular stop on canal tours, with boats passing beneath its medieval arch dozens of times daily, carrying passengers who are repeatedly warned to stay seated. It was July 29, 2015, in Union County, New Jersey, at the Garden State Parkway toll plaza near exit 140. Summer heat hung over dense weekend traffic as long toll lines crept toward the booths. Easy pass-only lanes moved slightly faster, while the staffed booths slowed to a crawl. Across the slowed lines, Lydia Crane, 57, owned a small residential cleaning service in Newark. Her days were spent driving between supply warehouses and apartment jobs across the city, often trying to squeeze extra appointments into a tight schedule. Employees described her as impatient with delays and quick to argue when something slowed the day. Traffic and long toll lines frustrated her, and stalled lanes often led to disputes with workers or other drivers. That morning, she was heading south for supply pickups and 2 cleaning estimates, which meant using the Garden State Parkway despite the usual weekend congestion. The toll plaza near exit 140 carried steady traffic heading toward the coast, with signs warning drivers to remain inside their vehicles, while easy pass lanes continued moving through the booths faster than the staffed lanes. Lines feeding the staffed toll booths stretched across the pavement. Cars moved forward a few feet at a time as each booth cleared another vehicle. When the line paused again, Lydia opened her driver's door and stepped out, leaving her sedan in the booth lane. Witnesses said she walked toward the toll window with her hands raised, angrily complaining about the delay and the slow-moving line. The attendant signaled for her to return to the car because traffic was still moving through the plaza. Lydia turned toward the line of cars behind her and threw her arms out in frustration. Drivers began honking as the booth lane remained blocked. Instead of returning to her vehicle, she walked away from the booth area toward the striped pavement separating the booth lanes from the EZ pass lanes. Several drivers shouted for her to stop as she stepped past the painted hash marks that marked the restricted zone. The markings separated the stop toll lanes from the EZ pass lanes where vehicles continued moving through the booths. Lydia ignored the warnings and continued across the striped pavement, moving directly toward the EZ pass lanes. Vehicles were still passing through the EZ pass lanes as drivers slowed while approaching the toll canopy. Lydia stepped into the first EZ pass lane while looking toward buildings across the roadway, apparently trying to cross the plaza instead of returning to her car. A commuter sedan entered the EZ pass lane, traveling about 30 miles per hour as traffic slowed, approaching the toll canopy. Witnesses said the driver braked as soon as Lydia stepped into the lane, but the distance was short. The front right side of the sedan struck Lydia before she reached the center divider. The impact lifted her onto the hood before she rolled off onto the pavement as the car came to a stop. Drivers in the booth lanes stopped and moved back as emergency services were called, and toll workers halted traffic through the EZ pass lanes. Responders arrived within minutes and attempted life-saving measures, but Lydia was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported severe blunt injuries to the head, chest, and pelvis that stopped breathing and circulation within minutes. Investigators spent hours documenting the toll area and Lydia's sedan still waiting in the booth lane where she left it. Witnesses confirmed she walked into the traffic lanes despite warnings. The driver remained at the scene and cooperated. Investigators concluded the driver had no reasonable chance to avoid the collision. It was November 20th. 2015, a gray Friday evening in suburban Ohio, the kind of town where the stoplights outnumber the restaurants and most people drive the same route home without thinking twice. The intersection sat where a 4-lane highway met a smaller cross street. Pavement was dry, visibility was fine, rush hour had thinned out. Just another evening where everyone was trying to get somewhere warm. Deanna Spiff was 38, worked as a clerk at a nearby warehouse, and by most accounts had an opinion about everything, and made sure you heard it. She wasn't the type to back down when someone told her what to do. She'd been written up more than once for arguing with supervisors over policies she thought were stupid. The kind of person who, if you told her the floor was wet, would walk across it faster just to prove she could. That night, she left the warehouse with 2 co-workers in a compact sedan. Deanna took the front passenger seat. Now here's where the decisions start to stack up. Except with Deanna, they weren't small. They were loud. The driver reminded everyone to buckle up. Deanna told him not to tell her what to do, said she'd been riding in cars since before he had a license. The driver pushed back. His car, his rule. Deanna grabbed the seatbelt, made a show of pulling it across her chest, then deliberately tucked the strap behind her back without clicking it in. She looked right at him while she did it, like compliance was beneath her. The driver let it go. Most people do when someone turns a seatbelt into a power struggle. But Deanna wasn't done. She spent the drive complaining. The temperature, the route, the warehouse changing the brake schedule without asking her. She told the driver he was going too slow, then too close to the car ahead. She changed the radio without asking. When the driver adjusted it back, she called him controlling. This matters, not because the argument caused the crash, but because it paints someone who had made defiance a reflex. Every rule was an insult. The seatbelt wasn't a strap she forgot to click. It was a line she refused to let someone else draw. The car was doing about 40, approaching an intersection with a green light. No reason to slow down, and then another vehicle entered the intersection against a red light. No buildup, no screeching tires. It struck the sedan directly on the front passenger side, Deanna's side. At 40 miles per hour without a seatbelt, the physics are brutal. Her body moved forward on impact. Her head struck the dashboard and windshield. The force threw her sideways into the door frame. She lost consciousness instantly. The crash folded around her in a way that the belt, the one she'd turned into a statement, was designed to prevent. The driver and rear passenger, both belted, survived with minor injuries. That's what makes this case unbearable. 2 people in the same wreck walked away because of a 3-second decision Deanna refused to make. Not forgot. Refused. Same car. Same crash. The only difference was a click and the pride that wouldn't allow it. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Deanna was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The police report listed the absent seatbelt as a direct contributing factor. The other driver was cited for running the red light. No further charges filed. A warehouse shift, a short drive, a belt tucked behind the seat to win an argument no one else was having, and a light someone else decided to run. What gets me isn't the crash itself, it's that she had the one thing that could have saved her in her hands, and shoved it behind her back because someone suggested she use it. The danger wasn't the intersection. It was the attitude that no rule and no person had the right to tell her what was good for her. The rear passenger walked away with bruises. The driver went home that night. Deanna didn't. The only variable was a seatbelt waiting for a click that her pride wouldn't allow. She didn't die from ignorance. She died from defiance. The seatbelt wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And physics doesn't bend for that.
It was August 18th, 2015, and San Antonio, Texas was deep into its summer. Afternoon temperatures were sitting above 95 degrees, the kind of heat that shortens tempers and makes everything feel more urgent than it probably is. The neighborhood was quiet on the surface. Residential streets, fenced yards, houses set close together. The kind of block where raised voices carry between properties and a dispute between neighbors doesn't stay private for long. By the time the argument reached the fence line, at least one neighbor had already stepped outside to see what was happening. Zenny Kryn was 47 years old. She worked in logistics dispatch, a role that runs on pressure, tight timelines, and the expectation that problems get resolved quickly. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily in a conflict and who pushed harder when she felt she wasn't being heard. On the afternoon she died, she was in the middle of an argument with a homeowner, a man in his mid-50s who worked in contracting, over a vehicle parked in a way she found unacceptable. The argument had started at the street and moved toward the property line. What strikes me about cases like this is that the personality description almost always sounds the same. Someone who pushed back, who didn't back down. And every time, I find myself wondering if they knew that about themselves, or if it just felt like being right. The homeowner was inside his yard behind a closed gate. He told her clearly not to open it and come in. The reason was direct. There was a dog loose on the property, and it was territorial. He wasn't being vague. He was telling her exactly what would happen if she came through that gate. Neighbors outside at the time later confirmed they heard the exchange. She opened the gate and stepped into the yard. The dog, a large, powerful breed consistent with guard-type dogs documented in the area, was loose within the enclosed space. A fenced yard with a single gate doesn't offer many options when something goes wrong, and the gate she had come through was now behind her. The dog reacted immediately. The combination of an unfamiliar person entering the enclosed space and the elevated voices of the ongoing argument triggered a defensive response. It moved toward her and made contact before she could turn back toward the gate. She attempted to retreat. In the initial struggle, she lost her footing and went down. Once on the ground, the dynamic shifted. The dog targeted the upper body and neck, behavior consistent with territorial defensive aggression in large breeds during a sustained encounter in a confined space. The enclosed yard gave her nowhere to move. The homeowner moved to intervene. Neighbors who heard the commotion called emergency services. The attack continued for a sustained period before the dog was successfully restrained. Witnesses described the homeowner making repeated attempts to intervene before the animal was finally brought under control. The confined space, the fall, and the time it took all contributed significantly to the severity of what followed. Severe trauma and significant blood loss occurred during the encounter, particularly from injuries sustained to the upper body and neck. Emergency responders arrived and secured the scene. Zenny Kryn was pronounced deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was traumatic injuries and blood loss sustained during the attack. Animal Control took custody of the dog for evaluation in accordance with local regulations. The homeowner cooperated fully with investigators throughout the process. Witness statements from neighbors confirmed that multiple warnings had been given before she entered the yard. The gate had been closed. The warning had been explicit. Investigators concluded the incident was a fatal animal attack following unauthorized entry into a secured private property. The record was straightforward. The warning was documented, the entry was documented, and the outcome followed directly from that one decision. I don't say this to be harsh, but the homeowner did everything right in that warning. He told her what was in the yard, why she shouldn't enter, and what the risk was. The outcome wasn't a failure of the warning. It was a failure to take it seriously.
It was August 9th, 2019, in San Antonio, Texas. The apartment was a small unit on the second floor of a building Sharon Pike had owned for 11 years. That afternoon, the tenant was working on the breaker panel on the far wall. The circuit was still live. He had not shut off the main breaker or applied any lockout. He was focused and working carefully. Sharon Pike, 56, had owned the building for 11 years and managed all 4 of her rental properties herself. She was not the kind of landlord who left things to a property management company or waited for scheduled appointments. She liked to handle things directly and on her own timeline. Tenants who had rented from her over the years had learned that she operated that way. She came when she decided to come. Sometimes she gave notice and sometimes she did not. Nobody had ever formally pushed back on it, and she had never seen a reason to change. And look, I have covered landlord cases before, and this pattern comes up more than you would think. The assumption that ownership means access, anytime, without warning. The tenant had mentioned a problem with the bathroom exhaust fan in a text message 2 weeks earlier. Sharon had read it, made a mental note, and driven over that afternoon to take a look. She did not call ahead. She did not send a message to say she was on her way. Standard lease agreements typically require reasonable advance notice before entry unless there is an emergency. There was no emergency that afternoon. There was a bathroom fan that may or may not have been working correctly. Sharon parked outside, climbed the stairs, unlocked the apartment door with her key, and walked in. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable, because what she walked into was not an empty apartment. The tenant did not hear her come in. He was wearing ear protection while working at the panel, standard practice when operating around electrical equipment for extended periods. The noise from the tools added to it. Sharon stood in the doorway and called out once. He did not respond. She assumed he was ignoring her. She stepped further into the apartment and crossed the room toward him, her irritation building with each step. She was in her own property, and as far as she could tell was being deliberately ignored inside it, and that was not something she tolerated. She stopped directly beside him and called out again, louder this time. He still did not look up. She reached out to force his attention and grabbed his arm. Her other hand made contact with the metal housing of the panel at the same moment. And this is the part that I find hardest to process. She had no idea what she was walking toward. A fault inside the panel had energized the metal enclosure. The tenant was standing on a rubber anti-fatigue mat in front of the panel. Sharon was standing on bare tile in regular shoes. When she grabbed his arm and touched the metal housing at the same time, her body became a path to ground through the tile beneath her feet. The current passed through her from the energized housing to the floor beneath her feet. The tenant felt a shock through his arm and threw himself backward, breaking the contact. Sharon dropped to the floor. Her muscles locked from the current and did not move after she hit the ground. The tenant called 911 immediately and began CPR under the dispatcher's instructions. Paramedics arrived and found Sharon unresponsive with a cardiac rhythm present but unstable. She was transported to University Hospital where medical staff worked to stabilize her. Despite the intervention, Sharon Pike died 4 hours later. The cause of death was ruled as cardiac arrest due to accidental electrocution from contact with an energized electrical panel. She was 56 years old. Investigators confirmed that the landlord approached him first. A decision to approach a man working inside a live electrical panel and reach out to force his attention while making simultaneous contact with an energized metal housing. The death was ruled accidental. The tenant was not charged, and what stays with me about Sharon Pike is that she had done this dozens of times before, walked in unannounced, handled things on her own terms. It had always been fine, until one time it wasn't.
It was July 11th, 2018. The afternoon air along an active lava viewing area in Hawaii's lower Puna region carried the sharp smell of sulfur as molten lava moved through open channels. Carol Laxman, a 62-year-old retired real estate agent from Phoenix, Arizona, stood behind safety barriers with her expensive camera equipment, visibly frustrated that the cordoned area prevented her from getting closer shots of the active lava flow. Carol had built a modest following on social media, documenting her travels after selling her real estate business 2 years prior. Her online persona centered on capturing dramatic landscape photography. often featuring herself posed near natural wonders. Friends described her as stubborn and entitled, someone who believed rules applied to others, but not to her. She had traveled to Hawaii specifically to photograph the active volcanic flows, booking a guided tour with a commercial photography company that operated viewing platforms near the lava fields. Active lava flows present extreme hazards beyond the obvious molten rock. The ground surrounding flows consists of newly formed crust that can be dangerously thin, concealing underground lava tubes where superheated gases and molten rock flow beneath seemingly solid surfaces. Temperatures near active flows exceed 1,800 to 2,200 degrees, hot enough to ignite clothing and cause instant tissue damage. That afternoon, park rangers had posted multiple warning signs around the designated viewing area. Recent volcanic activity had created unstable ground conditions, and visitors were repeatedly instructed to remain behind safety barriers. Carol had already been warned twice by rangers after ducking under ropes to get closer shots. Other photographers in the area, including a professional crew filming for a documentary series, noticed her increasingly reckless behavior. Around 3:45 in the afternoon, Carol deliberately crossed the final safety barrier, climbing over warning signs that explicitly stated the danger of ground collapse. Several tourists shouted warnings as she approached the edge of an active lava flow. A park ranger stationed about 75 yards away began moving toward her position, calling out over a loudspeaker for her to return immediately. Carol waved dismissively and continued positioning herself on what appeared to be solid rock, overlooking a glowing lava channel. She was attempting to set up a timed photo with the flowing lava behind her. The thin crust beneath her feet gave no warning. She stepped onto a thin skylight, a fragile crust over an active lava tube, which collapsed beneath her, dropping her onto a superheated lava channel below. The documentary crew's cameras captured the moment of collapse. Witnesses heard her screaming for approximately 4 seconds before the sounds stopped. The park ranger immediately radioed for emergency services, but the location and extreme temperatures made any rescue attempt impossible. A specialized volcanic response team arrived within 20 minutes, but could only establish a safety perimeter. 2 days later, after volcanic activity subsided, recovery teams located charred skeletal fragments at the flow's edge. The coroner's report confirmed death resulted from catastrophic thermal burns covering over 90% of her body, inhalation of superheated gases that destroyed her respiratory system, and thermal shock. The coroner determined she died within seconds from catastrophic thermal burns and inhalation of superheated gases. The documentary footage was turned over to authorities and never publicly released. Park officials temporarily closed the viewing area and installed additional barriers. Carol's social media accounts remained active for a few days, filled with comments from followers who never learned what happened during her final photo attempt, before being taken down at her family's request.
It was January 9th, 2017. The afternoon air at a municipal geothermal pool complex in Reykjavik hung thick with steam, masking a danger that would claim a life before evening. Ingrid Magnusdóttir Walsh, a 59-year-old administrative coordinator from Ohio who had relocated to Iceland nearly a decade earlier, stood arguing with pool attendants about water temperature for the third time that winter. Ingrid had married an Icelandic civil engineer in 2007 and embraced local culture with characteristic stubbornness. She visited the city's geothermal pools 3 times weekly, treating them as both exercise routine and social outlet. Co-workers at her accounting firm described her as direct and opinionated, someone who didn't back down from confrontation. Her husband later mentioned she'd been complaining about cooler pool temperatures all season, viewing it as poor facility management. That afternoon, Ingrid had spent nearly an hour protesting to staff about the outdoor pools feeling insufficiently warm. 2 employees patiently explained the geothermal heating system was undergoing maintenance adjustments, and temperatures would normalize gradually. The maintenance basin sat 30 feet away, a deep concrete reservoir used for heat circulation during system adjustments. Bright yellow temporary folding fencing with a locked access gate and multilingual warning signs cordoned off the restricted area. The basin held raw geothermal water near boiling temperature, designed for industrial heat transfer rather than human contact. Staff had positioned the barriers clearly clearly while technicians worked on temperature regulation equipment. Witnesses reported Ingrid walking toward the restricted basin while continuing her complaints about management incompetence. A junior pool attendant called out for her to stop. Ingrid ducked beneath the temporary fencing opening near the gate, apparently intending to demonstrate her grievance by approaching the maintenance area. She took 3 quick steps along the narrow concrete edge surrounding the basin. Her right foot slipped on the wet surface. Her lower leg plunged directly into the near-boiling water. A nearby pool attendant later described hearing a guttural scream that cut through the ambient pool noise, different from normal shouting. Ingrid grabbed desperately at the concrete edge, but her momentum carried her forward. Behind the barrier was water far hotter than anything meant for swimming. She fell partially into the basin, her torso and both legs submerging in the scalding water. The temperature caused catastrophic thermal burns within seconds. Human skin suffers third-degree burns in under 5 seconds at 155 degrees Fahrenheit. At temperatures approaching 200 degrees, tissue damage occurs almost instantaneously. A staff member rushed forward with a long rescue reach pole, hooking it under Ingrid's arms to pull her toward the edge. By the time they dragged her from the water, large areas of skin across her legs and lower torso had already blistered and separated from underlying tissue. Her clothing clung tightly to the burned areas as staff laid her on the concrete beside the basin. Staff immediately began cooling the burns with running water while shouting for emergency assistance. Staff called emergency services at 3:16 in the afternoon. An ambulance arrived about 7 minutes later, transporting Ingrid to a nearby hospital with a specialized burn care unit. Medical examination later documented third-degree burns covering approximately 47% of her body across both legs and the lower torso, with tissue destruction extending through all skin layers and into the underlying fat. She died at 2:23 the following morning from burn shock and subsequent organ failure. Pool management conducted mandatory safety reviews, but confirmed the barrier had been properly marked and positioned. It was March 12, 2018, on Route 17 northbound in Paramus, New Jersey. The afternoon was clear and dry, as steady weekend traffic moved between shopping centers and highway entrances. Delivery trucks and dump trucks traveled through the corridor, while brake lights rippled across the lanes as vehicles slowed and accelerated through merging traffic. Monica Hale, 45, worked as a dental receptionist in Paramus. Co-workers described her as organized but quick to lose patience when schedules changed or people slowed things down. Much of her routine centered around her daily commute, and her sedan had a phone mounted to the windshield, where she sometimes recorded short clips of traffic while talking about drivers she believed were careless or aggressive. Friends later said Monica often complained that other vehicles were following too closely behind her. Even in normal traffic, she sometimes believed certain drivers were deliberately staying near her car. In the weeks before the crash, she had mentioned several trucks that she believed had followed her along different routes during her commute, suspicions that often appeared in the short videos she recorded from inside her vehicle. That afternoon, Monica drove northbound along Route 17, heading home after work. Traffic was moderately heavy as vehicles moved between retail exits and merging lanes near Paramus Road. A loaded dump truck carrying gravel entered the same lane behind her sedan after merging from a side road. Witnesses later said Monica began checking her rearview mirror repeatedly while pointing toward the truck behind her. At several points, she slowed sharply before accelerating again, forcing the truck driver to brake as traffic compressed around them. Drivers nearby reported seeing Monica gesturing in her mirror and shaking her head while looking back at the truck. Each time the sedan slowed, the dump truck driver reduced speed and attempted to increase distance. However, vehicles in the adjacent lanes limited how far the truck could move. Traffic beside the truck prevented it from shifting lanes while the flow of cars continued through the corridor. As the vehicles approached a slight bend near an overpass, Monica's sedan slowed again. Witnesses described her braking abruptly while looking back toward the truck behind her. The car's brake lights illuminated as its speed dropped quickly in front of the larger vehicle. The dump truck driver applied the brakes immediately. The truck's air braking system engaged as the heavy vehicle slowed under the weight of its gravel load. A loaded dump truck weighs several times more than a passenger car and requires significantly more distance to stop. With limited space ahead and no open lane to move into, the truck continued closing the remaining distance. The front bumper of the truck struck the rear of Monica's sedan. The impact pushed the smaller vehicle forward several yards before both vehicles came to a stop in the lane. The rear of the sedan collapsed inward as surrounding traffic slowed, and drivers steered around the crash. Emergency services arrived within minutes as police secured the roadway, and paramedics attempted life-saving measures, but Monica was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be blunt force injuries to the head, neck, and chest, consistent with a high-energy rear-end collision. Investigators documented skid marks, vehicle positions, and statements from drivers who witnessed the crash. Witnesses reported that the sedan had slowed suddenly several times before the collision. Investigators later concluded that repeated sudden braking in dense traffic contributed to the crash. The dump truck driver remained at the scene and cooperated with authorities, who determined he attempted to brake but did not have enough distance to stop the loaded vehicle. No charges were filed. It was March 4th, 2018, a cool early spring evening in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where most of the restaurants close by 9 and everyone knows which diner has the best pie. This particular spot was a little family-run place off a 2-lane road. Nothing fancy. Checkered tablecloths, a handwritten specials board, maybe 15 tables total, the kind of diner where the staff remembers your order if you come in twice. Paula Dwan was 45 years old. She worked as a cashier at a shop in town and was the type of mother who turned small outings into events. Dinner at the diner wasn't just dinner. It was her and her teenage daughter catching up, talking about school, picking apart the menu like it was a 5-star restaurant. That evening, the two of them sat down for what was supposed to be exactly that, a normal weeknight meal. Now here's where I need you to pay attention, because what happened next wasn't sudden, it was slow, and every step of it was avoidable. Paula had a peanut allergy. She knew about it. She'd had it for years. When she sat down, she mentioned it to the server, but according to staff statements taken afterward, she downplayed it. She told them small amounts were usually fine. The server flagged it anyway and let her know the dessert she was looking at contained ground peanuts. Not traces, ground peanuts, baked directly into it. The staff offered to bring her something else. Paula declined. She insisted it would be fine, and she wasn't carrying any allergy medication with her. No emergency kit, no backup plan, just confidence that it had never been that bad before, so it probably wouldn't be that bad now. She ate the dessert. Several minutes later, still seated at the table with her daughter, she started coughing. A persistent, dry one, the kind you try to clear with a sip of water. Then the redness started showing, around her face first, then spreading down her neck. Her daughter noticed. The staff noticed. Breathing became visibly harder, that tight, labored sound that tells you the airway is narrowing. The staff offered to call emergency services right away, and this is the part that's hardest for me to sit with. Paula hesitated. She delayed the call. Maybe she thought it would pass. Maybe she didn't want to make a scene in front of her daughter. But those minutes mattered, and they were spent waiting instead of acting. By the time the situation became undeniable, she collapsed near the table. Her body had moved into full anaphylactic shock, and without medication to slow it down, there was nothing anyone in that diner could do. The ambulance arrived roughly 6 minutes after the call was finally made. Paula was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause was listed as a severe allergic reaction. Anaphylaxis triggered by a known allergen she had been explicitly warned about in a food she chose to eat, without carrying the one thing that might have bought her enough time. The health inspection that followed found no violations. The staff had identified the allergen, communicated it clearly, and offered an alternative. Every box was checked on their end. And honestly, that's the detail that sits with me the heaviest, is that everyone in that diner did exactly what they were supposed to do, and it still wasn't enough to save her from herself. And I think that's what makes Paula's story land differently. There was no reckless driver, no unstable ground. There was a woman who knew she had an allergy, heard the warning out loud from someone standing right in front of her, and decided it didn't apply this time. And her daughter was sitting across the table for all of it. I keep coming back to the delay, not the dessert, not even the missing medication. The moment where help was offered and the answer was not yet. That gap, those few minutes between the first cough and the 911 call, that's where the outcome was probably decided.
It was March 4th, 2016, and Columbus sat under a flat gray early spring sky. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s, that damp, stubborn cold that lingers after winter. Traffic was building into the afternoon rush, lanes filling, signals cycling. Nothing unusual. On paper, it was routine. The danger didn't come from the road. It came from a decision shaped by refusal rather than uncertainty, one that began before the car ever moved. Davenquish was 50 and carried herself like someone who believed she was the exception. Office management had trained her to keep things moving, override problems, and stay in control. People described her as dismissive, someone who minimized concerns and treated caution as unnecessary interruption. Slowing down wasn't just inconvenient to her. It was something she resisted, even when the situation clearly demanded it. That pattern worked in controlled environments. Here, it didn't. That afternoon, she went to a clinic because her body forced the issue. Slurred speech, dizziness, and a severe headache. Clear signs of a stroke in progress, serious enough to interrupt her day. The staff were direct. She should not drive and needed immediate care. Her response wasn't uncertainty. It was dismissal. Documentation showed she minimized her symptoms and rejected further care, prioritizing continuation of her day over the risk already unfolding. The clinic recorded the warning and her decision, creating a clear point where the outcome could have changed. She left anyway. In the parking lot, a bystander noticed something was wrong and tried to intervene. Her condition was visible now: slowed movement, disorientation, the kind of situation that makes strangers step in. She ignored it, got into the car, and drove, continuing as if nothing required her to stop, as if the problem would resolve itself through motion alone. This is where it shifts from frustrating to dangerous. She wasn't just deciding for herself anymore, she was extending that risk to everyone on the road. She entered a multi-lane road as traffic thickened, and within moments, the issue was visible. The car drifted, corrected late, then drifted again. Speed fluctuated without reason. It wasn't aggressive, it was unpredictable. Drivers around her created distance, reacting to something they couldn't fully identify but immediately recognized as unsafe. Inside the vehicle, the stroke was progressing. Blood flow to critical areas of the brain was being restricted in real time. Motor control weakened, reaction time slowed, awareness slipped, and despite multiple opportunities to stop earlier, she remained behind the wheel, still in motion, while her ability to control it was actively deteriorating, each second narrowing the margin for recovery. There was no dramatic moment, just a gradual loss of control. The vehicle drifted once more, then slowed to a stop in the lane, engine still running. Traffic moved carefully around it as emergency calls came in. She was found unresponsive in the driver's seat, the vehicle becoming still only after she no longer could continue. What stands out is how many points existed to prevent this. The clinic warned her. A bystander intervened. Drivers recognized it. Every signal was there, and each one was dismissed through action, one after another, until there were no more chances left to take. She was transported to a hospital and later pronounced dead due to complications from the stroke that had already begun before she left the clinic. Investigators confirmed she had been advised not to drive and chose to ignore it. No collision occurred. The incident was classified as a fatal medical emergency while driving, with the critical decisions happening well before the final moment. There was no hidden hazard here, just a progression of decisions where caution was overridden until control was gone and nothing remained to correct it.
It was October 3rd, 2016, in Newark, New Jersey. The hallway on the 4th floor of the building was narrow the way most apartment hallways are. Hardwood floors that carried every sound, and a short half-flight stairwell dropping away just around the corner at the far end. The kind of space where two people passing each other have to turn sideways. Lori Bennett, 47, was an administrative assistant who had lived in the building for 3 years. Her neighbors knew her less as a friend and more as a presence. She had a habit of appearing in the hallway when something bothered her and staying there until it was resolved. Music too loud. Trash left out an hour past the building's posted time. A bicycle leaned against the wrong section of wall. Small things that she treated as serious ones. If you haven't lived close to people like this, you probably might not understand. The neighbor across the hall had adjusted more than once, lowering music mid-evening, changing his trash schedule, moving things she found out of place. He had learned it was easier to comply than to argue. And this is the part I find interesting. He had always just complied, every single time. So Lori had no reason to expect this evening would go any differently. That evening, his packages had arrived while he was out. 4 boxes stacked against the wall outside his door. lined up neatly and not blocking the walkway. He had no way to time a delivery. The packages were there when he got home and he intended to bring them inside shortly. Lori had seen them first. She was waiting in the hallway when he came through the stairwell door. She did not let him get to his apartment. She told him directly that the hallway was not for storage and that the boxes needed to be moved. He explained that they had just been delivered and that he would bring them inside in a few minutes. He was calm, he was reasonable, he had just walked in the door. What gets me is that he was already going to move them. There was no actual dispute here, there was just Lori, and that was not good enough for her. Nothing is actually enough for Karen's. She told him the hallway was a shared space, and she should not have to navigate around his deliveries. He said he understood and would handle it in a moment. She told him a moment was not good enough. He stayed near the wall, keys still in his hand, not raising his voice. She stepped closer, leaning into the conversation, her words getting sharper while his stayed flat. Without realizing it, she had drifted toward the stair opening, her back foot sitting just at the edge of where the floor dropped away. She shoved him back with both hands. He stumbled, caught the wall, and stopped. He looked at her. Her weight was already forward, and her feet were not fully set on the hardwood floor. As she shifted her weight back after the shove, her heel found nothing behind it. One step back was all it took. The stairwell edge was directly there, and there was nothing to catch on. She went down the half flight without a recovery step, no railing in reach, and her head struck the iron post at the base of the stairs. And this is the part I find hardest to sit with. She shoved him. He caught the wall and stopped. She was the one who lost her footing. The neighbor was on the phone with emergency services before he reached the bottom of the stairs. Lori was on the floor and not responding. Paramedics arrived and transported her to University Hospital. Imaging confirmed a serious brain bleed from the impact. She was admitted to intensive care. Lori Bennett died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. She was 47 years old. The cause of death was ruled as complications of traumatic brain injury due to a fall down a stairwell. Investigators reviewed the incident and confirmed the sequence. A pattern of prior complaints, a confrontation over packages that had been delivered less than an hour before, a forward-leaning shove on a hardwood floor at the edge of a stairwell, a loss of footing with nowhere to recover. The neighbor was not charged. The incident was ruled accidental. The packages were still outside his door when investigators arrived, and the thing that stays with me is that he was always going to move them. He said so twice.
It was February 23rd. 2015. The Gold Coast beaches stretched under deceptively inviting skies, the kind of afternoon that drew families to the water, despite conditions that would prove deadly. Kylie Goldstein, 34, was about to make a series of decisions that would cost her everything. Kylie had lived on the Gold Coast for 8 years, moving from Brisbane after her divorce. Her 2 children, ages 7 and 9, often appeared hesitant around her, and neighbors had witnessed multiple public confrontations where Kylie berated them for minor infractions. She had accumulated 3 formal complaints from the local surf lifesaving club for previous incidents where she had argued with lifeguards. Swimming and beach activities formed Kylie's only reliable bonding time with her children, something she planned rigidly every weekend, regardless of conditions. She viewed beach safety warnings as suggestions rather than rules, evident from frequently telling other parents that lifeguards were overly cautious and that she knew the beaches well enough to make her own decisions. That afternoon, red flags lined the beach at a popular swimming area, warning of dangerous rip currents generated by offshore storm systems. Surf life-saving officers had announced beach closure over loudspeakers 3 times between 1 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon. Most families had already packed up and left. Kylie arrived with her children, immediately spotting the red flags. Her son pointed them out, asking if they should go home. According to the kids, Kylie told them they were swimming, or they would lose screen privileges for a month. At the water's edge, a lifeguard approached and explained the closure. Kylie interrupted repeatedly, demanding to know his qualifications and insisting the water looked fine from where she stood. The lifeguard radioed for backup, as Kylie raised her voice, attracting attention from the dozen remaining beachgoers. She lectured him about taxpayer rights and overregulation, while her children stood behind her, clearly uncomfortable. When the lifeguard turned to address another family, Kylie grabbed her children by their wrists and pulled them into the water. They waded to waist depth within 90 seconds. The rip current, invisible from shore but devastating in force, caught all 3 immediately. The beach's steep nearshore shelf meant waist depth came quickly as they stepped out, and the rip formed a strong seaward channel just beyond the breaker line. The children began screaming as the current dragged them seaward. Kylie, likely realizing the danger too late, panicked and tried swimming directly against the current, exhausting herself instantly. 4 lifeguards entered the water within 30 seconds of her submergence. One paddled a rescue board, while another secured a rescue tube, and an inflatable rescue boat was launched and stood by for recovery. Following protocol, they prioritized the children, who were closer and more manageable. 2 lifeguards reached the kids within 2 minutes, securing them on rescue boards. Kylie was now 200 feet offshore, flailing wildly and screaming incoherently. Her panicked movements accelerated her fatigue. 2 lifeguards swam toward her position, but a large set of waves pushed her under. She resurfaced briefly, arms thrashing, before disappearing beneath the surface. The crew called emergency services immediately when they lost sight of Kylie. Visibility in the churned water made her location impossible. A multi-agency search involving surf life-saving teams, water police, and helicopter units continued until nightfall and resumed at dawn. Kylie's body washed ashore 2 days later, discovered by early morning walkers 3 kilometers south. Prevailing currents and wind likely carried the body along shore. The incident was later reviewed through a coronial investigation, and updated safety signage was installed at the beach entrance following the findings. Her children received mandatory trauma counseling funded by Victim Services.
It was June 21st, 2014. The waterfront restaurant overlooking Palm Beach's intracoastal waterway hummed with Saturday evening conversation and clinking glasses. Cheryl Dunmore sat across from her husband Dennis at a premium outdoor table, unaware that her final meal was already being prepared in the kitchen behind her. Cheryl, 58, ran a modest bookkeeping service from her Boynton Beach home, managing accounts for local contractors and small businesses. Her meticulous attention to numbers extended to every aspect of her life, particularly restaurant service. Servers at multiple establishments along the waterway recognized Cheryl as a regular customer who voiced complaints frequently and loudly. Friends described her as exacting but capable, someone who expected the same precision from others that she demanded of herself. Cheryl and Dennis had spent over a decade making Saturday dinners at waterfront restaurants a ritual. Cheryl always ordered medium rare steak and found something to critique. At 7:35 p.m., a 17-year-old server brought her steak. Before he could leave, Cheryl launched into her usual loud critique, gesturing at the plate while chewing a sizable piece, drawing attention from nearby tables. The accident happened mid-sentence. Cheryl's voice changed abruptly, the sharp tone transforming into a strangled gasp, her words cut off completely. Within seconds, her face flushed deep crimson as the partially chewed meat lodged firmly in her airway. Her hands flew to her throat in the universal choking gesture. A witness seated at the adjacent table noticed her distress first, as her skin darkened from red to purple. Dennis stood quickly, moving behind his wife and wrapping his arms around her torso. He attempted the Heimlich maneuver but positioned his hands too high on her chest, well above the navel where effective abdominal thrusts must be delivered. His attempts accomplished nothing. A former EMT dining across the patio saw the commotion and ran over. A server had already rushed toward the host stand to alert the manager, who initially believed Cheryl might cough the food loose and delayed calling 911 while the former EMT tried to help. By the time he reached them, Cheryl had already been struggling to breathe for several minutes. She was staggering, unable to support her own weight. The EMT quickly turned her slightly forward and delivered several firm back blows between her shoulder blades before repositioning his fist just above her navel and well below her ribcage. He drove a series of hard inward thrusts into her abdomen. After several thrusts, a chunk of partially chewed steak expelled onto the floor where it landed beside the table leg. Cheryl collapsed immediately afterward. The prolonged oxygen deprivation had already caused severe damage. The EMT checked her airway, saw no remaining obstruction, and lowered her onto the patio decking. He began chest compressions as restaurant staff cleared surrounding tables, creating space for the rescue attempt and pushing chairs aside to form a path from the patio entrance. A staff member searched for an automated external defibrillator, but reported that the restaurant did not have one available on the patio. Cheryl showed no response as CPR continued. The restaurant manager called 911 at 7:41 in the evening. Emergency responders arrived 7 minutes later and took over resuscitation efforts with advanced equipment. Cheryl was transported to a nearby hospital, where doctors later pronounced her dead. The medical examiner's report listed asphyxiation due to airway obstruction as cause of death, with anoxic brain injury as a contributing factor. The restaurant closed the patio briefly for cleaning and reopened the following evening. Cheryl's memorial service drew family and longtime clients who remembered her exacting standards but struggled to reconcile them with such an ordinary, preventable death. It was September 18, 2017, in Mesa, Arizona, at the intersection of Southern Avenue and Dobson Road. Late afternoon heat hung over a crowded intersection as cars idled through a long light cycle, waiting for the signal to change. Darla Whitman, 48, worked as a cashier at a neighborhood grocery store in Mesa. Co-workers described her as blunt and quick to argue when customers questioned coupons or prices at the register. She insisted on following store rules exactly and often pushed back when shoppers challenged them. Managers had received complaints about her tone, but she showed up on time and frequently covered extra shifts. Darla drove a 2012 Nissan Altima and kept a compact .380 pistol loaded in the center console. Family said she began carrying it after a roadside argument years earlier, keeping the gun within reach during everyday drives between work, errands, and home. At about 4:35 p.m., traffic along Southern Avenue slowed again as the signal changed. Vehicles rolled forward a few feet and stopped. As the line tightened near the intersection, a pickup behind Darla's Altima bumped the rear of her car at a very low speed. The contact left minor scratches and a shallow dent in the bumper. The pickup driver stepped out and approached with his wallet in hand, ready to exchange insurance information. Witnesses later said he appeared calm and apologetic. As the traffic light turned green, horns began sounding behind them as drivers tried to move through the intersection. Darla opened her door and stepped directly into the lane instead of moving her car. She walked between the vehicles and began shouting at the pickup driver about the damage, pointing toward the rear bumper of her Altima. Several motorists waved for both drivers to pull into a nearby parking lot entrance, but Darla remained in the roadway, continuing the argument as traffic stacked up behind them. The signal changed again while the lane remained blocked. Horns echoed across the intersection as drivers tried to squeeze around the stopped vehicles. Darla ignored them and returned to her Altima, opening the driver's door and reaching into the center console. When she stepped back into the lane, she was holding a compact handgun in her right hand. Witnesses later told investigators the pistol remained pointed generally downward as she continued arguing across the front of the vehicles. She raised the gun slightly while gesturing toward the pickup driver, using it like a pointer as she continued confronting him in the middle of the lane. During the exchange, she stepped closer to the pickup's front bumper and struck the metal grill with the side of the handgun to emphasize her point. The impact jolted the weapon in her hand, and as it struck the grill, the pistol discharged once. The bullet struck high on the left side of her chest, just below the collarbone. Darla staggered backward and collapsed beside the driver's door of her Altima. The pistol slipped from her hand and came to rest on the pavement near the lower edge of the door. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic slowed around the intersection. Fire and medical crews arrived within minutes and attempted resuscitation beside the vehicle, but circulation could not be restored, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported the bullet entered the upper left chest, passed through the lung, and severed a major vessel near the heart, classifying the death as accidental. Investigators closed the intersection for several hours, documenting the roadway, collecting witness statements, and recovering the pistol from the pavement nearby. It was May 2016, and the Utah desert was doing what it does best in late spring, baking everything under a sky so blue it almost looked fake. The kind of day where the heat comes off the sandstone in waves and the air smells like dust and dry brush. The state park Overlook was busy with families, couples, and hikers making their way along the paved path that ran along the ridge. Becca Vant was 34 years old. She worked in retail, the kind of job where you spend most of your day managing other people's problems with a smile on your face. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily. She had opinions, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. She was the type of person who would argue with a staff member over a posted policy, not out of cruelty, but because she genuinely believed rules were often made by people who didn't think things through. That personality followed her everywhere. That afternoon, she was at the park with her brother and her 2 kids, a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. The Overlook had a view that stretched out over a wide canyon, layers of red and orange rock dropping hundreds of feet below. It was genuinely stunning. The Overlook had a waist-high metal railing along the edge, installed after previous incidents at the same location. Multiple posted signs warned about loose rock and unstable ground beyond the barrier. A park ranger had already told the crowd directly to stay behind the railing because the ground past it was not stable. Becca heard all of that, but like most rules she didn't agree with, she didn't treat it as something that actually applied to her. At some point during their visit, a bighorn sheep appeared on the slope just beyond the barrier, probably only 30 or 40 feet away. People around her were pointing and pulling out their phones. Becca wanted a better shot. The railing, from her perspective, was in the way. She stepped past it. She moved about 8 to 10 feet beyond the barrier onto open sandstone. The surface looked solid from a distance, but loose gravel sat on top of slanted sections of stone near the Overlook edge. She held her phone up and began backing toward the drop, trying to frame the shot. What happened next was pieced together from witness accounts. Her heel caught a patch of loose gravel on a slanted section of rock. She didn't trip dramatically. She just lost her footing, the kind of quiet, sudden shift that doesn't give you time to react. Her balance went, and she went with it. She fell down a steep, rocky incline, dropping approximately 35 to 40 feet before striking the side of her head on exposed stone. Witnesses at the railing saw it happen. Her brother was among them. Park medics reached her within several minutes. There was no pulse when they arrived. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was blunt force head trauma. Witness statements confirmed she had been warned, and the ranger's address to the crowd was documented in the report. What I keep coming back to isn't the fall itself. It's how many layers of warning were already in place. A permanent barrier, multiple signs, a ranger who spoke directly to the crowd, and still, the view felt more important than the boundary. I don't say that to be harsh. I think most of us have pushed past something we probably shouldn't have. The difference is that most of us don't pay for it the way Becca did. Her 2 kids were standing at that railing when it happened. That detail alone is something I haven't been able to shake. The official report concluded the ground was unstable. Warnings had been clearly posted and verbally communicated, and the fall was consistent with terrain conditions at that section of the Overlook. No foul play, no equipment failure, just a decision made in a few seconds that couldn't be undone. And for me, Becca's case keeps circling back to one thought. She saw the barrier, she heard the ranger, and she decided none of it applied to her. And that's what makes it stick, because it wasn't reckless in the way we usually picture reckless. It was just confidence in the wrong moment.
It was January 23, 2018, and Minneapolis was locked in the kind of winter that makes the whole city feel smaller. Temperatures had been fluctuating for weeks, freezing, then briefly thawing, then freezing again. That cycle is exactly what makes ice unpredictable. And it's what had been happening at a small neighborhood pond on the city's south side. The surface looked solid from the bank, but the signage at the water's edge told a different story. Kelly Spuff was 39. She worked in office administration, structured, routine-driven, used to things making sense. People who knew her said she pushed back when she felt she was being told what to do unnecessarily. She had the day off and went out for a walk to clear her head after a frustrating week, needing to feel in control of something small. She wasn't reckless in the usual sense, but when challenged, she had a tendency to push, to prove the point instead of stepping back. She arrived at the pond already in that mindset, looking for space, not a confrontation. The thin ice signs were clearly posted. A man nearby with 2 young children noticed her approaching the edge and warned her directly. He told her the ice wasn't safe. She paused just long enough to register it, then kept going, like the warning didn't apply to her, like it was something she could personally assess and dismiss. Near the shoreline, the ice was white and opaque, the kind that looks solid. Further out, darker patches showed where it was thinner. Those patches weren't subtle. The man called out again, louder. Witnesses said her steps changed, more deliberate. It stopped looking like a walk and started looking like a decision she didn't want to walk back from. I've covered enough of these cases to know that a sign and a verbal warning together almost never change the outcome. Kelly had both, and neither was enough. She stepped past the sign and onto the ice. The surface held near the edge. She moved farther out, stomping as she went, testing it or making a point. It wasn't cautious. The stomping had a rhythm, exaggerated like she was proving something to the people watching. The cracking sound carried back to the bank. By then, the man had stopped warning and started pleading, telling her to come back, that his kids were watching. She kept going anyway, adding just a few more steps that made all the difference. She made it about 15 to 20 feet out before the surface gave way. The water was several several feet deep. Cold shock is immediate. Gasping, rapid breathing, loss of control. She reached for the edge, trying to pull herself out, but the ice kept breaking under her grip, pushing solid ground farther away. The man found a long branch and extended it toward her, but he couldn't reach without risking the ice himself. He stayed at the edge and kept trying. Within minutes, cold incapacitation set in. Strength dropped. Coordination failed. Her movement slowed. What stands out is how fast it turned, from control to panic, from proving a point to fighting for seconds. With no time left to correct it, she was conscious and trying for a period that felt long to the people watching, and there was nothing they could do. By the time emergency services arrived, she had gone under. Responders recovered her from the water. She was unresponsive. Efforts to revive her failed, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was cold water immersion, cold shock, incapacitation, then drowning. Investigators confirmed both signage and a direct warning had been present. The pond was temporarily closed. No changes to signage were recommended. It had been clear and correct. The warnings worked. They just weren't followed.
It was July 14th, 2015, in Marietta, Georgia. The afternoon heat had settled over the dog park. It was split into two clearly marked sections: a smaller fenced enclosure on the left for dogs under 25 pounds, and a larger open section on the right for bigger breeds. The signs were posted at both gates. They were not easy to miss. Tara Whitfield, 48, was an office manager at a logistics company in Marietta. People who worked with her described her as someone who was difficult to reason with once she had made up her mind about something. That afternoon, she had driven to the park with her terrier, a small dog named Biscuit that weighed just under 10 pounds, specifically because her usual walking route near her neighborhood was being repaved, and she wanted somewhere with shade and open ground. She had never been to this park before. That afternoon, after arriving at the park, she walked through the entrance and looked at both enclosures. The small dog section was crowded. A group of children were sitting along the fence with their parents, and the area felt hot and cramped with nowhere comfortable to stand. The large enclosure had a row of trees along the back fence, plenty of open ground, and far more room to move. Tara read the sign at the gate that said dogs under 25 pounds must use the small enclosure. She looked at the large enclosure again. She decided the rule was inconvenient and pushed the gate open and walked in. And look, she read the sign. That detail matters. She saw it, understood it, and decided it did not apply to her. A man standing near the fence noticed immediately and called out to her, starting to explain that the section she was entering had size restrictions. Tara looked at him, told him to learn how to mind his business, and walked in before he could finish his sentence. What gets me about that moment is that she had two chances to turn around before she even got to the gate. She walked past both of them. Inside the enclosure there were 7 dogs, 2 golden retrievers, a Labrador, a boxer, a border collie, and 2 German shepherds. Tara held Biscuit against her chest and stood near the gate, watching the other animals with visible tension. The dogs were moving around the enclosure the way dogs do, chasing each other, circling, sniffing the fence line. Normal dog park behavior, nothing aggressive, nothing directed at her. One of the German shepherds broke away from the group and moved toward her at a steady trot. It was not running, it was not growling. It was doing what dogs do when something new enters their space. It was curious. The owner, standing on the far side of the enclosure, noticed and called the dog back by name. And this is where I personally think everything could still have been fine. The owner was already calling it back. The situation was not escalating. Tara escalated it. She did not wait to see if the dog would respond. She raised her voice immediately, shouting at the dog to get back and demanding that whoever owned it come and get it under control. A man on the far side of the enclosure called out that it was his dog and began calling it back by name. The dog slowed, looked back toward the sound, and then continued moving toward Tara. It was still not showing aggression. It was a large dog closing distance in an enclosed space, and that was all it was doing. Instead of leaving, she stayed. She had entered the enclosure on her own terms, and she was not going to be pushed out of it by a dog. That was not how she operated. Instead, she stepped forward, putting herself between Biscuit and the approaching animal, and directed her voice at the owner across the enclosure. She told him this was exactly why people like him should not be allowed to bring dogs like that to a public park. She said if he could not control his animal, he had no business owning one. The dog was now within a few feet of her. She drew her foot back and kicked it hard in the side. This is where everything took a devastating turn. The dog reacted instantly. At that distance and with that provocation, there was no gap between the kick and the response. The animal lunged and the bite closed on her neck and upper body, the force of the dog's full weight driving her to the ground. She went down hard. The dog did not release immediately. Other owners ran toward her shouting, two of them grabbing at the dog's collar and pulling, while a third stepped between them trying to create space. The dog released after several seconds and moved back toward the fence line. Tara was on the ground and not responding. People knelt beside her, applying pressure to her neck, while others were already on the phone with emergency services. Animal control and law enforcement responded and secured the enclosure. The German Shepherd was held pending investigation. Preliminary findings based on witness statements suggested the incident followed a sequence of escalating decisions, beginning with unauthorized entry into a restricted area and ending with physical contact initiated by the victim. The incident was classified as an accidental death. The cause of death was ruled as fatal traumatic injuries resulting from a dog attack following provocation. The part that still gets me is she would have walked away, but she decided to stay. However, Biscuit was collected later that evening by a family member.
It was April 14th, 2016. The afternoon sun hung over a neighborhood dog park in South Austin, Texas, casting long shadows across the fenced enclosure where families gathered with their pets. Margaret Lee, 58, had no children of her own. Her family said that after her divorce 8 years earlier, she had channeled all her maternal instincts into Prince, whom she had raised from a puppy. Co-workers described her as defensive and confrontational, particularly when anyone questioned her dog handling practices. She had been cited twice by animal control for off-leash violations, but dismissed the warnings as overreach by bureaucrats who did not understand proper animal behavior. Friends said that Margaret frequently posted on social media groups for pit bull owners, defending the breed against what she called unfair stereotypes, while simultaneously documenting Prince's aggressive responses to perceived threats. That afternoon, the park was busier than usual. Several families with young children occupied the grassy area adjacent to the dog enclosure. A father in his early 30s had brought his 3-year-old daughter to watch the dogs from a safe distance. Margaret unleashed Prince immediately upon entering, ignoring the posted signs and verbal warnings from nearby dog owners. When approached by the father, who politely asked her to restrain her dog near the children, Margaret responded that Prince was perfectly trained and posed no danger to anyone. Prince initially appeared calm, sniffing the ground and exploring the perimeter. His body was rigid, a low rumble vibrating in his throat, and he moved forward without the typical sniff and turn most dogs show. Within minutes, the dog approached the toddler, who had wandered closer to the fence line. The father moved to block Prince's approach, and when the dog lunged at the child with bared teeth, showing stiff posture, forward ears, and raised hackles, the father instinctively kicked at the animal to protect his daughter. The kick struck Prince in the shoulder, causing the dog to yelp and temporarily retreat rather than escalating. Margaret witnessed this from across the park and ran toward the father, screaming that he had assaulted her dog. Witnesses reported that she shoved the man with both hands, nearly knocking him over. Before anyone could intervene, Margaret pulled a canister of pepper spray from her jacket pocket and aimed it at the father's face. A sudden shifting gust funneled the spray back into her face at point-blank range. The concentrated capsaicin caused immediate blindness and respiratory distress. She dropped the canister and clawed frantically at her burning eyes, her vision completely obscured. The spray left her disoriented, coughing, and functionally blind. Disoriented and panicking, she stumbled backward through the park gate, which someone had left open during the commotion. Margaret staggered blindly toward the street, her hands still covering her face. Multiple witnesses shouted warnings, but she could not orient herself. She reached the curb and stepped directly into the path of a city bus, traveling approximately 40 miles per hour on the adjacent road. The arterial road offered no crosswalk near the gate, and shrubs along the sidewalk partially obscured the driver's view. The driver had no time to brake. The impact threw Margaret's body nearly 25 feet. A bystander called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but Margaret had died on impact. The medical examiner's report documented multiple blunt force trauma injuries, including severe skull fractures and catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. The ME noted trace amounts of capsaicin in the ocular tissue consistent with recent exposure. Prince was impounded by animal control for a standard 10-day rabies observation, while the city initiated a dangerous dog review. Margaret's estate became the subject of potential civil claims following the incident, and the father later pursued charges related to the assault and pepper spray escalation.
It was March 12, 2015. The air conditioning hummed steadily through a large indoor shopping mall in Scottsdale, Arizona, as midday shoppers moved between stores under fluorescent lights. Within hours, a routine dispute over an expired coupon would end horrifically. Diane Anderson was 54 years old and worked part-time as a property records clerk for a small real estate office in Mesa, Arizona. She lived alone in a modest apartment and spent most afternoons at the mall, drawn by discount promotions and clearance sales. Her co-workers described her as detail-oriented but combative, someone who would spend 30 minutes arguing over a $2 discrepancy. Diane had a reputation among mall retailers for lengthy disputes about expired coupons, return policies, and price matching. She kept a binder full of clipped coupons organized by expiration date, though she frequently tried using them past their valid periods. That Thursday afternoon represented another typical shopping trip for Diane. She had visited 3 stores before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, successfully using coupons at 2 locations. Her mood was reportedly upbeat as she entered the food court, carrying shopping bags and her coupon binder. Diane approached a soup and sandwich counter at 1:05 in the afternoon and placed her order with a 19-year-old cashier named Elena. When Diane presented her coupon, Elena politely informed her it had expired 2 weeks earlier. Diane refused to accept this, pointing repeatedly at the printed date while raising her voice. The line behind her dispersed as other customers moved to different counters. For nearly 20 minutes, Diane continued her argument, leaning across the counter and gesturing with the coupon clutched in her right hand. A mall security guard noticed the disturbance and began walking toward the counter. A witness seated nearby watched while eating lunch and reportedly noticed Diane's words beginning to slur slightly as she continued shouting. Around 1:23 p.m., Diane leaned across the counter, pointing a coupon at Elena. She pressed her left hand to her head, then her left face drooped while her right arm stayed extended. Her speech slurred, breathing became strained, and her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the counter, knocking over 2 bowls of hot soup, which spilled onto her chest and neck as she slid to the tile floor, her right arm trapped beneath her. A woman immediately moved to Diane's side and knelt down. She said Diane's eyes were half open but unfocused, showing no recognition or awareness. She checked for breathing and found shallow, irregular gasps. She quickly placed 2 fingers against Diane's neck and detected a faint but present pulse. The left side of Diane's face remained completely slack. She immediately called 911 while the security guard reached the scene. Diane remained motionless except for sporadic chest movements. A small pool of drool formed on the tile beneath her mouth. Paramedics arrived approximately 6 minutes later. They immediately began oxygen administration and transported Diane to a nearby hospital. Witnesses later reported that Diane had become completely unresponsive during transport as her breathing grew increasingly labored. A CT scan performed in the emergency department revealed a massive intracerebral hemorrhage with significant midline shift. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as massive intracerebral hemorrhage with brainstem compression. The time of death was recorded as 4:47 in the afternoon. Mall management temporarily closed the counter for cleaning and filed an incident report. Local news published only a brief police blotter mentioning a medical emergency at the mall. The soup and sandwich counter reopened the following morning. It was August 6, 2013, on Interstate 80 westbound near Vacaville, California. Afternoon rush traffic filled the highway as cars and freight trucks crept forward through dense congestion. Along the right edge of the road, a narrow shoulder ran beside the lane, marked clearly for emergency use only. Heather Lawson, 46, worked as a medical billing clerk and followed the same highway commute home nearly every weekday. Co-workers described her as organized at work, but easily irritated outside the office. especially during her drive home through crowded traffic. Public records showed several speeding citations over the previous decade. Friends later said she often complained about other drivers and believed people on the road slowed her down on purpose. That afternoon, Heather stopped at a fast food drive-thru before leaving the shopping area near Vacaville. As she pulled onto the highway and opened the bag at a red light, she noticed her burger came with only one small ketchup packet. Witnesses later recalled seeing her throw the bag onto the passenger seat while gesturing in frustration as traffic ahead slowed. By the time she merged onto Interstate 80, rush hour congestion had already formed. Vehicles moved only a few car lengths at a time before stopping again. Drivers waited patiently as the line crept forward, but Heather repeatedly closed gaps between cars and sounded her horn. Witnesses later said Heather began weaving within her lane while searching for a way around the traffic ahead. When vehicles slowed again near the Cherry Glen Road area, she steered onto the narrow shoulder despite signs clearly stating it was for emergencies only. Dust lifted from the gravel as her sedan accelerated quickly along the shoulder, passing rows of slow-moving vehicles while traffic in the travel lanes barely moved. About half a mile ahead, a highway patrol officer had stopped on the shoulder to assist another vehicle. When he saw the sedan approaching rapidly along the emergency lane, the officer stood beside his patrol car and signaled for the driver to stop. Heather slowed briefly and pulled alongside the patrol car. Witnesses later told investigators that she leaned toward the officer and said she needed to get through because she was pregnant and feeling sick. As the officer stepped toward the driver's window from beside the patrol car, Heather suddenly accelerated and continued driving along the shoulder. The officer returned to his patrol car and activated his lights and siren while traffic ahead remained heavy, leaving little space for vehicles to merge between lanes. After several seconds on the shoulder, Heather tried forcing her way back into the right lane between two cars creeping forward in slow traffic. Her tires struck the loose gravel beyond the shoulder line, causing the sedan to lose traction and slide sideways across the lane. Drivers braked sharply as the car spun across two lanes of traffic, striking the metal guardrail before rebounding across the roadway and slamming into the concrete median barrier, where the airbags deployed and the vehicle came to a stop. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic slowed around the crash site. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation on the roadway, but were unable to restore circulation. The coroner later determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head and chest from the high-speed impacts. Investigators documented tire marks along the shoulder and gravel scuffs where traction had failed. Witnesses confirmed the sedan had driven along the emergency lane before the crash. It was July 20th, 2017, a hot Thursday afternoon in Missouri, the kind of summer day where the air sits heavy and the water is the only place anyone wants to be. The lake was a popular recreational spot, big enough for motorboats, pontoons, and the occasional jet ski cutting lines across the surface. By mid-afternoon, the water had decent traffic, wakes crossing over each other, engines humming in the distance, families anchored in coves with coolers and music. Rhoda Krell was 36 years old. She worked at a salon in town and was the kind of person who had to be in charge of everything. If there was a group outing, she picked the date, picked the location, and then found something wrong with all of it once they got there. That afternoon was one of hers. She'd gotten 3 friends together for a day on the water. They rented a motorboat from a small marina along the shore. A standard open bow rental, maybe 18 or 19 feet, enough room for 4 people and a cooler. Before they even got the keys, Rhoda told the rental operator the boat looked old and she wanted a different one. He explained it was the only one available. She asked to speak to a manager, then threatened to leave a review that would shut the place down. Her friends stood on the dock pretending to check their phones. When they boarded, the operator went through the basics. Life jackets were provided for every passenger. He strongly recommended wearing them at all times. Rhoda's friends put theirs on or kept them within reach. Rhoda picked hers up, told the operator it was dirty, and tossed it back under the seat. She told him she'd been on boats her whole life and didn't need someone at a rental dock telling her what to do. He asked her one more time to stay seated while moving and to wear the jacket. She waved him off. "I'm not telling you this to ridicule her. I'm telling you this because every piece of what happened next connects directly back to this moment. The jacket was right there. The warning had been given multiple times, and she didn't just decline it, she turned it into a confrontation she needed to win. They headed out onto the lake. One of the friends was driving, keeping a reasonable speed. Rhoda was standing near the side of the boat, not braced against anything. One friend asked her to sit down. Rhoda told her to stop worrying. Another brought up what the operator had said. Rhoda told her the operator didn't know what he was talking about. Then another boat passed, moving fast enough to throw a large wake across their path. Rolling waves, maybe 2 or 3 feet high, hitting them broadside. The bow lifted suddenly, not violent by boating standards, but abrupt, and Rhoda was standing. Her weight shifted. She lost her balance and went sideways over the rail. Not a dramatic launch, a stumble that the low rail couldn't stop. She hit the water near the side of the boat. Her friends expected her to surface immediately. A few seconds passed, then a few more. She didn't come up. The driver cut the engine. One of the friends jumped in and pulled her back onto the boat within seconds, but she was already unresponsive. Without a life jacket to keep her head above the surface, those few seconds underwater were all it took. Her friends started CPR right away. A rescue team reached them within minutes, but Rhoda never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead on the water. The official cause was listed as drowning following an accidental fall overboard. The operator was not cited. Passengers had been warned. Life jackets had been provided. Every safety measure had been offered, explained, and rejected. And that's the part that sits with me. The jacket was on the boat, within arm's reach. The warning had been given over and over, and every single time she treated it like an insult, like the rules existed for other people. It was just a wake, a stumble, and a missing vest. 3 things that lined up in the worst possible order on an otherwise perfect afternoon. Her friends were right there. They got her out in seconds, and it still wasn't enough. A life jacket would have held her face above water for every single one of those seconds. I keep imagining being one of those friends, the ones who asked her to sit down, who reminded her about the jacket, who did everything right, and still having to carry that.
It was May 10th, 2016, and Tucson, Arizona was already running hot. Daytime temperatures in the desert push well past 95 degrees by midday in late spring. And on this particular afternoon, the air was dry and still. The kind of conditions that bake everything outdoors and push most people inside. The shed at the back of the property sat in partial shade, but that meant little. What was inside it hadn't changed. Christina Zorn was 52 years old. She worked in property management, a role that kept her in constant contact with maintenance issues and the question of when to call a professional and when to handle something herself. By her neighbors' accounts, she leaned heavily toward the latter. She trusted her own read on a situation. That confidence wasn't always wrong, but it made her slow to accept advice she hadn't asked for. The hive had been building inside the shed long enough that more than one neighbor raised a concern and encouraged her to contact a licensed removal service. She wasn't interested. She looked at the hive, decided it was manageable, and came back from a local supply store with an over-the-counter insecticide. What she dismissed was the environment itself. Tucson sits well within the range of Africanized honeybees, a population documented across the Southwest, known for a faster and more sustained defensive response than other varieties. High midday temperatures increase colony activity and aggression. This hive wasn't isolated. It sat near a fenced yard where neighboring children regularly played. They were outside that afternoon. At a distance, she set up a ladder alongside the shed, climbed up with the insecticide, and began spraying the hive directly. She had no protective gear, no face covering, no gloves, no long sleeves. Nothing between her skin and the colony. The response was immediate. A large number of bees emerged and began stinging. The areas hit first were her face, neck, and arms, all exposed, all unprotected from the start. The natural response in that situation is to get down and move away. She didn't. She kept spraying, which extended her time in the swarm and prolonged the disturbance to the colony. The stings continued to accumulate. At some point, she dropped the can and lost her footing, coming down hard at the base of the shed. I don't know why I fixate on her hands, but I do. My own mother was the same way, always had to finish what she started, even when it was clearly going wrong. I'd watch her struggle with jammed windows, burnt cookies, broken vacuum cleaners, never asking for help. The fall wasn't from a dangerous height on its own, but the swarm didn't stop when she landed. Witnesses in the yard next door reported the bees continuing to attack for a period before gradually dispersing. The mechanism that kills in mass envenomation cases isn't always an allergic reaction, it's volume. Hundreds of stings introduce enough venom to overwhelm the body's ability to process it. Organ function deteriorates, circulation is disrupted, it builds, and by the time the outward signs are visible, it's already underway. By the time she stopped moving, the swarm had largely dispersed. Neighbors moved the children indoors and called emergency services. Responders arrived to find Christina unresponsive at the base of the ladder. The spray can was on the ground nearby. The hive was still active above. She was confirmed deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was toxic envenomation, mass stinging resulting in systemic venom overload that disrupted organ function beyond the point of recovery. Investigators confirmed that multiple neighbors had warned her and recommended a licensed removal service before the attempt. The insecticide was later noted as inadequate for a colony of that size and species. No protective equipment was found at the scene. The hive was removed days later by a licensed pest control team in full protective gear, the same option available to her before any of this started.